me later. It's really good that you're here. This is the session on accountability, about citizen participation in the data revolution. Who is actually here to talk about the data revolution? Anyone interested in the data revolution? Okay, I'm going to disappoint you because this session is not about the data revolution. This session, for me, is about something far more important. It's what some people call the accountability revolution. And my worry when we have conversations about data is that we often make this mistake of seeing data as an end in itself, that better data is going to solve the world's problems. And I'm sure that all of us recognize that actually data and better data is a means to a much more important end. And so, you know, even the subtitle of this data festival, Better Data for a Better Tomorrow, if you drop that for a better tomorrow, then all of us in this room would be having very geeky conversations about how to do better and more effective data gathering. But instead, I think what's really exciting and what's really important about this festival and this conversation happening at this time is the connection to the accountability revolution. That we have before us huge opportunities and challenges to harness the power of data and information to promote that accountability revolution. And so this session, Accountability and Citizen Engagement, will last for the next 4.5 hours, where we're going to do a deep dive and have an in-depth conversation about what we mean about accountability and citizen engagement. We're going to take a look in this first part of the session before coffee at some experiences, 3 very different experiences and approach to this question of citizen engagement and accountability. We'll have a coffee break, and then you're going to get rapid-fire 2-minute presentations that Mariam's going to harness about some amazing initiatives that are taking place all around the world to promote citizen engagement and accountability. And then we're going to close with a session just reflecting a little bit and drawing out some lessons. We'll finish at 6, and then you'll have some time to have a drink. So that's the plan. My name is Danny Sriskandaraja. I work for an organization called Civicus, which is a global civil society network. We're a member-based organization that seeks to support citizen action. We have members now in more than 160 countries, big NGOs, some of the biggest non-governmental organizations in the world. But actually 70% of our membership are organizations that are very small, that have turnover of less than US $70,000. And so, in our experience, trying to nurture this important and growing network of citizens and civil society organizations, when we talk to them about things like the data revolution, they think we're crazy. And worse, they're suspicious of our riding on the latest bandwagon, that we're caught up in sort of data fetishism. Because for most of the activists that we work with, the idea of data and information is only interesting and important if it's about delivering better public services, building better institutions, empowering citizens and people. And for them, when I use a phrase like the data revolution, many of our colleagues actually are deeply cynical, because they worry that this is the first revolution that will not involve people. That this is the first revolution that apparently is going to happen inside some servers sitting in Silicon Valley rather than inside the hearts and minds of people. And I think one of the aims, of this session this afternoon is to explore how we can connect the data revolution with the accountability revolution, how we connect data with empowerment, how we think about data as a means to a much greater end. So I'm really looking forward to this session. As I said, this is by far the most interesting panel. We have a first presentation by Angelina Fisher, who's an adjunct professor of law at New York University, who, along with some colleagues, has been looking at accountability. It's right there, it's the first word of this session. And she and colleagues have been looking at what we might mean by accountability in the post-2015 sustainable development context. And she's going to share some lessons and observations from that process. And then we're going to have Julia Cacheru, who's the International Engagement or Network Officer at the Sunlight Foundation, which some of you will know was an initiative set up to throw sunlight, onto public institutions, particularly in the United States of America, and have done some amazing initiatives. My favorite one is something called Politwoops. Have a look. It's trying to log where American politicians have tweeted but then deleted their tweets. And what Sunlight has been doing with colleagues is logging where this happens and archiving these, because often when politicians say something stupid or irresponsible on Twitter that they retract it, well, Sunlight's logging, holding them to account for what they say or claim they didn't say. And it's that sort of fantastic initiative that Julia is going to be talking about. But she'll be talking about their experience globally and some of the work they're doing at the sort of international stage. And then a colleague and friend, Elvis Mashiri from Twaweza, amazing East African-based organization, a network, Twaweza, Make a Change in English. Elvis has been working for the last few years on a very important initiative in Kenya and Tanzania, now expanding to other countries, about giving citizens voice. In Swahili, it is called
Sauti za Wananchi.
That's what I said. Giving people a voice. So we're going to hear from Angelina, Julia, and then Elvis. If you want to ask questions and you have Wi-Fi or data, please use the Data 2015 hashtag. Hopefully I will have Wi-Fi as well, and I'll pick it up. If you want to tweet me directly, then I'm at Civicus SG, CIVICUS SG, as in Secretary General. So we're going to start. Are we ready? No one's asleep yet. Good. Angelina, over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak at this very exciting conference. Although I fear after you've mentioned the Twitter and politicians, this isn't going to be quite as exciting, but I'll do my best. So my presentation is based on a report that my clinic, International Organizations at New York University School of Law, had done together with the UNDP on accountability through civic participation in the post-2015 development agenda. In the report, we surveyed a number of interstate accountability mechanisms, both global and regional, and have looked also at some citizen-driven initiatives. And the idea was to map out an integrated accountability framework across all levels, global, regional, national, and local. And so through our analysis, we've identified 4 kind of guiding principles to ensure meaningful citizen participation. So the report, I should point out, focuses on the processes by which people, particularly members of civil society, can and should be able to monitor, evaluate, and demand accountability. We did not look at the standards because there are other initiatives working on that, notably the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Center for Economic and Social Rights. So in my presentation, I won't go through the entire report, but it will instead give you an overview of the guiding principles that we've come up with, and also talk about the relationship between civic participation and data. Okay. So just so we have kind of a common framework and know what we're talking about, we've defined what we think accountability means. There isn't a consensus among kind of different groups, but this, I think, brings in the most common elements. At the core, of course, it's a relationship of power, and it's the ability and authority of the people affected to be able to demand those who hold power to answer for their actions, to act when they're required, to accept responsibility when they fail, and to be subject to sanctions and remedy. Our report focused on accountability of state to individuals, but of course the development landscape is a lot more complicated, and this was just one piece of it. I don't want this to be taken that we're de-emphasizing other accountability relationships, such as to private parties, international organizations, and so forth, because they're all interrelated. And a lot of the things actually I will talk about can be applied to other actors as well. Okay, so civic participation, of course, enhances accountability. And we've characterized very broadly two modes of participation. One is called decisional participation, and it's kind of what it sounds. It's the right to vote or otherwise exercise a role in making decisions. And an example of participatory budgeting would fall into that category. And the other is non-decisional participation. So here it's an opportunity to make submissions, propose decisions, or otherwise provide input. And in most of the mechanisms that we surveyed, the non-decisional participation was the most common form. And broadly, we found that civil society typically participates in kind of three categories: agenda setting, dialogue and deliberation, and then monitoring and reporting. And so based on the analysis, we have come up with kind of these four guiding principles for civic participation. And when we talk about participation, we of course mean meaningful participation. We found that for the civil society groups, it is often unclear whether their views in fact have any impact. And that can lead to consultation fatigue, which of course delegitimizes the process and decreases participation. And we also found that civil society groups need to understand how their participation can influence. In other words, the process has to be predictable and transparent. And so here are the kind of the guiding principles. The first one is transparency. And here we mean both informational and procedural transparency. So informational transparency ensures that everybody has access to the data that's relevant to their policy goals. And that's what we talked a lot about in the prior sessions. But there's also procedural transparency, and that is understanding the process by which citizens can have impact. And that's important in order to prevent kind of capture by special interest groups and to ensure that everybody who's concerned can actually be heard. And I should also note that without certain conditions, such as resources and capacity that actually enable effective use of information, transparency can in fact disproportionately empower those with resources. Okay, inclusiveness is the second one. And here we found that it's not enough for the information to be out there. There has to be an active outreach to different groups, and particularly to those who are most marginalized, in order to ensure that they have a capacity and opportunity to participate in policy formation and implementation, as well as in monitoring and evaluating. And that means that institutional actors must often ask themselves, whose voices are relevant to the certain issues? How should such relevance be established? What resources are required to include the relevant voices? The third principle is one of deliberation, and this is kind of meaningful discourse and capacity building. So it shouldn't, we don't want the civil society's kind of input to be just included pro forma. It has to somehow be meaningful and genuinely considered and incorporated into evidence-based policy outcomes. And that means that you need to direct resources, again, towards equipping civil society, again, with a particular focus on the most marginalized groups. And the last one is responsiveness. This, of course, includes policy outcomes, but probably more important, it's having a built-in continuous feedback loop so that there is constant follow-up, right? So it's not a one-off thing. Okay. So how does this all kind of connect to data? So of course, information is key to accountability and participation. And without information, people cannot hold state officials or other actors accountable. And information can come in different forms, but since data is one of them, and that's what we're focusing on, I'll focus my remarks on that as well. One point to emphasize is there's actually already a lot of data. There's so much reporting that states do at different levels that's being produced and being published. And it's, of course, very helpful. Depending on how data is presented, it can diagnose or frame a problem. So, for example, ASER, which is a grassroots effort in India to assess basic reading, writing, and math skills, is credited to refocusing the debate in India from access to education to quality of education. Data can provide information about performance of relevant actors. It can also enhance transparency, not just by revealing the problem or revealing their performance, but because publication of data may actually require actors who are subject of that data to justify their actions, to respond to the data. And data can enhance participation of civil society, particularly if they're active participants in the data collection. And even the process of data collection itself can be transformative. So to give you an example, when India had its first consultation for the Universal Periodic Review, the participation of civil society was very low. But there was a sense that the very process and the expectations that it raised instigated important conversations. And as a director of People's Watch in India noticed, the process helped civil society to mature. But it's important to highlight that the availability of data or its wide promulgation isn't a magic bullet to either accountability or participation, nor is data neutral. So the overarching questions that I think we should be asking ourselves is, which data gets traction? Whose data gets traction? How do regular people without a lot of technical expertise determine which data to use or how to use it? What are the implications of using certain data over others? Under certain circumstances, data can become a technique of governance. And by that I mean that before it is even used in any active way, the mere collecting and publication of data can impact behavior, affect allocation of resources, and alter power relations. For example, when the World Bank publishes their doing business indicators, which ranks states on how easy it is to do business in them, that fact that these rankings are out there affect national reforms. When PISA, an OECD assessment of how children perform at school, ranks states on their education performance, it drives national reforms. And measurement in and of itself can become a standard. What is a failed state? What is the rule of law? It is what the index measures. So at NYU, we actually have a larger project on governance by information where we explore in depth the governance effects of different forms of data. And I won't go into too much detail because of the time constraints, but I'm happy to entertain questions in the discussions. But I do want to highlight a few effects of data that may not be so positive, or at least that we should be thinking about. Data can create or reinforce inequities. So one of the often cited evidence versus digital divide, right? The technology-driven initiatives can further alienate the poorest and least connected citizens, who are indeed the most vulnerable to the challenge these projects seek to address. And to the extent that these mechanisms primarily engage educated, LinkedIn, and politically active segments of society, they may indeed perpetuate a cycle of elitist participation, which really only benefits the upper and the middle classes. Data can define or redefine social categories. Decisions about what to measure and which data to collect and how to use it can do that. One of the starkest examples is the arrangement of castes in India by the British as part of the consensus. So at the time, the castes in India were quite fluid and situational, but the British wanted to arrange them in an orderly hierarchy. And so they selected pollution as the key marker of lowercase status. And thus the category of untouchability emerged as a very distinct category. So by redefining castes in terms of these categories that applied across subcontinent, the British rendered it a very fixed and intractable social entity, but one that could be easily counted and compared. Other examples of this effort include measures of violence against women. What counts as violence can create or redefine categories of victims or vulnerability, decide who gets to support, who gets access to resources. Data can reemphasize certain accountability relations. So consider a donor-dependent state that must fulfill a specific set of requests from the donors, often which including providing data, reporting on things. The state is accountable to the donor for the use of money. It's also accountable to the citizens, but it may prioritize accountability to the donor, reporting, whose reporting obligations are tied to the funding. In fact, states may experience a data overload, having to collect and report different data to different global and regional institutions. And many states won't have capacity to do that, and so they'll be forced to prioritize certain relations over others. Data can also misidentify the problem or miss it entirely, because not everything that matters can be quantified. So an example, in the internally displaced people's camps in Haiti, there's data on how many tents, how many liters per water person, but there's no attention to the widespread sexual violence against women. In education, focus on measures of learning such as test scores may focus attention on quality of teaching, but may miss the larger socioeconomic context, such as poverty and segregation that affect learning. And finally, data can disempower, and this links with the idea of inequities. Oops, sorry. This means that the decisions that were carried out by political leaders are now made by technical experts who construct the measures and develop the processes of classification and counting that produce the numbers. So what is the rule of law? What is good education? Often these are defined by what is being measured, but who decides what should be measured? This also means that political debates about compliance with obligations, human rights norms, sustainable development goals, shift the arguments about how to form an indicator, what should be measured, and what each measurement should represent. These debates typically rely on experts in the field of measurement and statistics, usually in consultation with experts on substantive topics, and the outcome is presented as a form of knowledge, not as simply a representation of methodology. And this process can eventually lead to disempowerment, particularly among the marginalized community. And so, what do we do? All right. How do we draw the benefits of data while being mindful of the issues that I raised? Well, here are some suggestions. And the idea that here too the 4 guiding principles that I mentioned before should apply: the transparency, inclusiveness, deliberation, and responsiveness. All right. The most important thing is that individuals need to be active participants in data collection, in data translation, and data use. We should demand transparency, not just of data, but also the sources and intermediaries. We need to make sure that decisions about which data to collect and how to collect it are made through a process that's inclusive and deliberative. And we need to embrace multiple sources of data, as well as different kinds of data and information. And lastly, but not least important, is those seeking accountability must have the capacity and the opportunity to use data in order to monitor and evaluate and demand response. And that means there has to be an education process. That means there has to be basic infrastructure. And there has to be work towards a political and legal environment that allows, for example, for things like free flow of information, access to social media, no digital device, and so forth. Our report includes a sample of some citizen-driven initiatives that we thought were particularly interesting, as well as a case study of sort of an integrative and accountability system that we think can be a good model for citizen participation. So I can talk about those as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angelina. Your last point reminded me that I didn't do something I was supposed to do, which was as part of the sort of the data festivalness, Wingu, Engine Room, and Civicus have been collecting examples of citizen-generated data initiatives, and they've been published today, right now, a few minutes ago. And if you want to look on the Twitter sphere, I think my colleague Kate Higgins will have just tweeted the link. Keep tweeting. My favorite so far is from Mitchell Toomey, who says, next up at the Data Festival, Data for Accountability, hosted by the awesome Civicus SG. Please use words like awesome. Keep going, thank you. Julia Caseru.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. As Danny mentioned, my name is Julia, and I represent this awesome foundation, the Sunlight Foundation from the States. Based in Washington, D.C., we actually do a lot of different things, which I'm not going to talk about today. But just to give you a little bit of background, we focus on money in politics in the US, and we try to increase the access of both citizens and investigative journalists to government data, to republish and revisualize the data that the US government is publishing on a daily basis in formats. this is my slide, in formats that are more searchable and analyzable. And I'm not going to do any slides today because what I find when I do slides is that I get so engaged in my presentation that I forgot to click through them. So when I look up, it's still my first slide. So today, no more slides for me. But what I intend to talk about today is a project that we did in the last few months to try to create a framework for measuring the impact of what we're doing, because we do think that, especially through our international work, which is increasing, we have encountered a lot of people and civil society organizations, but also policymakers, government officials, investigative journalists who struggle not only with explaining what their own impact is, but why this is all worth. Like, why are we doing this? Why are we opening up all these data sets and try to, advocate for better disclosure norms? What is the kind of change that we're trying to achieve? And what we found is that there's been amazing research around the economic benefits of opening up government information and opening up data, but not so much work done around how this kind of work, this kind of change this kind of work is actually leading to long-term social and political change, like reducing corruption and clientelism, or increasing and improving government efficiency, or creating more spaces for citizens to take part in the democratic process. So those are the kinds of things that are really hard to measure, really hard to evaluate, but a lot of what we're doing in this field, and especially organizations who work around the accountability aspect of open data and the data revolution, are trying to create or achieve that kind of change. And it's really, really hard to prove that what we're doing is useful. So those two questions, like how we can actually, show the specific impact that we're having, and also how we can evaluate the change that we're creating in the ecosystem that we're working in, we're sort of making us think about what we can do in this field. And again, Sunlight is working a lot with civil society organizations from around the world who are doing similar work than we're doing in the US, trying to build their capacities, trying to give them potentially useful and constructive advice on how to do their work. And because they were all struggling with that question, we decided to create a repository, to create a database of impact stories that demonstrate what is the actual change that is going on with these projects and with these initiatives. And let's talk a little bit about impact again, and the examples that I'm going to give you now are also good examples of how Sunlight is trying to achieve as an organization itself. But for instance, there is a website, there is a tool in Russia that was developed by or created by Alexander Navalny. I'm not sure if you've heard of his name before, but he's one of the few opposition leaders in Russia who hasn't been murdered yet. So he created this website called Ruspil with a few lawyers. And the idea was that government contracts are published in a way in Russia, actually in a pretty accessible and open format, but no one is doing anything with those contracts, right? Like, they are there, this is amazing, but what is the actual accountability aspect? Like, what is the actual change that releasing those contracts will achieve? So they decided to take those contracts and create a website that makes it easier for citizens to search for the contracts that are taking place in their own neighborhood, like the school that is being built in that neighborhood, or road construction works, and take a look at whether there's anything suspicious about the contract that they think might, ring a bell that not everything is going in the way it should go. I'm not saying it involves corruption, but maybe some sort of waste is going on, or it's not necessarily the best contractor that the government has chosen, rather someone who is good friends with some of the officials in the Public Procurement Authority. So the website was created to create citizen oversight over government contracts, and what is happening is very specific, actually. The lawyers who joined the initiative are taking citizens' complaints and take it to the court pro bono. So the initiative is about taking those contracts that are suspicious to court, and as an impact of that initiative, a lot of money has been saved in Russia. This is the kind of the Russia story that we're not telling a lot, and there's so much going on in that country right now that it's hard to emphasize the good stuff that is happening there, but there is good impact of citizen-led open data initiatives. And then we also have, as a second example, again, in this case, measuring the impact is pretty simple. It's very similar to measuring the impact measuring the economic impact of open data projects. This and that amount of money was saved, right? But the impact that we're talking about, the kind of long-lasting social change, is again not just figures, not just numbers. It's citizens being more political, it's citizens being more conscious of their democracy, it's investigative journalists being more enabled in their work. So there's a lot of bits and pieces in that ecosystem that are really hard, really extremely hard to measure. The second example that I wanted to give, we have a huge amount of, again, mostly civil society-led initiatives on opening up the budgets of a local government or the national budget, trying to republish the budget and government spending in a way that citizens can understand it better and investigative journalists can work with that better. Again, how do we measure the kind of impact there? There's no figures, there's no, very specific data about how releasing the information will lead to change. And in some cases, the change might even be reversed. Like we know of an amazing initiative in Argentina to scrape, which is to try to get information from not so machine-friendly formats. That's probably the worst way to explain it, but I don't want to go into the details about technology. Still, scraping means you try to extract data from formats and republish it in ways that are readable by machines and digestible and that allow for further analysis in better ways. So there was this project of several Argentine civil society organizations who created a website and published all the asset disclosure of elected officials in Argentina, and then the policy changed to the worst because government officials were so afraid that citizens will know more about their financials that they actually introduced a worse law. So that said, there's a lot of different kinds of impact that open data initiatives and digital transparency projects can achieve. And we pulled all those examples, bad ones and good ones, together in a huge repository that you can find on our website at sunlight.com, sunlightfoundation.com, at the international page. And the website or the repository includes a lot of anecdotal story about different kinds of initiatives from around the world and what their impact is. But what we found going through all those examples is that the way people interpret impact is very different. Of course, it wasn't a surprise. But we thought that what might even be more helpful beyond just creating a repository that people can use for their advocacy purposes is to create a framework for open data initiatives and digital transparency and accountability initiatives to try to measure their long-term impact in better ways. And so we used a methodology that was originally developed by RDRC for measuring the impact or evaluating the impact of development projects. And the idea there, and I'm just going to give you a very short summary of the methodology, and if you're interested in it, I think it fits this context amazingly, and it can be used for various different reasons, but mostly to create a theory of change for the kind of long-lasting change that we want to achieve, to create a theory of change for a project, for an initiative, and then develop a framework in which the change that is happening in the ecosystem can be measured with very robust, very rigorous ways through creating milestones for each stakeholder. And I'm not going to go into the details about the actual methodology because that would take another 20 minutes to explain. But if you're interested in being able to measure if you have an open data project, an open data initiative, either from civil society or from government or big international NGOs, please come to me, please ask questions, because I think this is, in a way, the best way for this movement to move forward, to be able to better tell the story that we're talking about, and to be able to better tell the change narrative that we're talking about. So thank you so much. If you're interested in the details, please let me know and ask me questions.
Thank you very much, Julia. They've changed the slide too quickly, because not only was that an awesome presentation, but did you notice their awesome logo? They've used a Venn diagram for a logo. It doesn't get better than that, if you like Venn diagrams. I'm going to ask Elvis Mushi to finish the third and final of our presentations, to talk a little bit about
Sauti za Wananchi.
Sauti za Wananchi, on behalf of Twaweza. There you go. Look at the Venn diagram.
Good afternoon to you all, and I'm so excited to share a little bit of what we have done in gathering nationally representative data using mobile phones in Tanzania. I will float this as Sauti za Wananchi, but you can look at it like mobile phone panel surveys and how are they working, particularly in developing countries, and we can think about the developed countries thereafter. So this is an initiative that is under Twaweza. Twaweza simply means we can make things happen, and it's a civil society organization in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. As a young African man, I was warned a lot of times with claiming my position in the family because I'm the firstborn. I will try and claim the position in the African family for Sauti za Wananchi as Africa's first national representative mobile phone survey, particularly because I have not heard that there's anybody else there who's done this before us, but I stand to be corrected. So what simply, if you will allow me to set a ground here, Twaweza has gone through a few transitions, and in our latest transition, we are now a problem-driven organization, and what we tend to do most of the times is ask ourselves, what is the problem that we're trying to fix? And once you identify the problem that you're trying to fix, then you can look at it, you can look at your short-term success and your long-term success and how it would look. And one of the problems that we have actually identified is that there exists a clear data gap in the East African countries, and I think in a lot of the African countries, and this can be looked at as well in a lot of the developing or the global South countries. Policymakers most of the times are faced with huge challenges where they're supposed, or most of the times where they use outdated data sets that are gathered by the National Bureau of Statistics. And naturally, a report would take 2 to 3 years. So data is gathered in 2012, and probably in 2014, that's when the results are published. So they would use outdated data sets to publish a lot of the reports. And again, what you'd also find is we have very poor administrative data, which a lot of the times is still in the paper format. And it's a huge challenge, you know, to just aggregate that data and use that data that is collected on a daily basis to make informed decisions. The same problem also exists with ordinary citizens. They really can't benchmark their lives against others. They don't know what is happening. What do other citizens feel about this particular issue? And there's that mini effect that almost comes when you publish results and when you publish research results that really make people think slightly different of where are they and how are things happening, particularly in their subgroup. A similar thing happens with the media, where we do have a lot of data reporting, but there's very little content that is being generated that is evidence-based or data-based. So yeah, this gap is the gap that we're trying to really address with Sauti za Wananchi. And in trying to figure that out, what we really saw, this is back in 2010 when we were setting this up in a pilot survey in Dar es Salaam, was that there was a growing number of phone ownership by then in Tanzania. And the projections, this is a chart that I've used for the last 2-3 years, is that by 2015, 36 million Tanzanians out of the 50 million Tanzanians would own mobile phones. But again, as you see, that is not universal. To now go to the details of how can we really address this. So the mobile phone, clearly, as I indicated in the previous slide, is the way to go. So what do you do with the mobile phones? Do you use the internet? Do you use USSD? Do you use SMS-based approach? And in the initial phases, and to date, we still are strong believers that voice is the way to go, because USSD in itself and SMS has some literacy issues that you would find in a number of countries. So you really have to understand your context, where you are, where's the phone ownership, and what are the gaps of the approach that you'd pick against the other approach. So we found it very compelling to use voice, and the approach that I will demonstrate, particularly with this mobile phone panel service, is really around voice and how we have gathered data using voice in Tanzania, and we're now scaling up into Kenya and Uganda. If you want to look at it, it has 3 major phases: a baseline phase, which is the initial phase, and this is clearly a traditional research methods where you draw a randomly representative sample, and this would differ from country to country. Particularly in Tanzania, we're interested in giving the story of rural and urban, and we're not able to really go so low because, again, if you look at the survey in itself, then disaggregating the data at the lower level would mean then you'd have to draw a larger sample. So you would draw 10 households in an enumeration area, you'd draw 1 respondent, and then you'd hand out a mobile phone and a solar charger. I'll explain why we hand out mobile phones, but as you've seen in the numbers and the figures that I've shown in the slide before, what is clear is that phone ownership, as much as it's growing, in a lot of the developing countries, it's not universal ownership of mobile phones. The second phase of this survey then becomes a mobile phone survey, or you would say where literally things would be happening on the ground. What you'd want to do is to capture that information using a questionnaire. Then you'd use a call center to call the panel of people that you'll have drawn. You'd analyze that data and produce a report. Once you've produced your report, what then would follow is you would go into that engagement space, really using those results to reach out and close that feedback loop at the funnel end. So you could look at the baseline as the foundation, where you draw people, and what our first press release said, it said, Mr. President, you have 2,000 Tanzanians on the phone. So these are people that are there on the phone, and as many as we are in this room, we could come up with topics, we could come up with ways in which we could collect interesting information that would really help us understand what is really happening on the ground, where are things and what are ordinary citizens really feeling about a number of these issues. What this graph is not showing is what happens once you have published your results, in an official launch where you'd call the media and key stakeholders, particularly from the government, and then you'd put your data online and you'd have a direct outreach to different target groups. Is that explosion? If I had the room to draw another bubble at the top of this graph, is that explosion, which really is the space where now this information becomes power, and that's the harder part to really measure, and that's the hard question that we continuously get asked. I'll try and demonstrate ways in which we think we made a contribution to a number of things, but again, you can't directly claim everything. That's the harder part of working in civil society compared to business. In the business world, the question is, have you managed to bring in money? And if yes, what have you brought on the table? The end game there is a lot different compared to the end game in civil society. So that explosion is really interesting. It would mean traditional media would pick the results. It would mean social media would pick the results. It would mean people would have conversations on social media. Activists would use that data to directly reach out to policymakers who are active on their social media platforms. And again, that is the conversation that you'd want to start happening. Ordinary citizens who are also on social media would use some of that information to reach out to their leaders and ask them, where are we on this? And leaders are almost put on the spot. Clearly there's new mechanisms that are creating this connection between ordinary citizens and their policymakers. We can go further on that. I want to really share how we've seen this grow, and I think I've highlighted it a little bit. 2 minutes. So we have started as a small pilot survey, grown into East Africa. What started as a household survey is now a facility survey. We have what is a very interesting component which is citizen monitoring, where we have 200 people in these places that we have randomly drawn, and we ask them to do one nice, interesting thing, and literally go out, reach out and see what is really happening. And this becomes more tangible. If there are no medicine supplies in hospitals, reach out to those hospitals, give us the information on where is it, how is it, and what's the situation on the ground. When we get insights on what is happening, that's what we would tend to do. What was Twaweza only now has third-party usage, and really, this is a platform that can be used by other players outside Twaweza. Why do we hand out mobile phones? We really want the approach to be as inclusive as possible. What you realize, 63% of our baseline panel had mobile phones, the rest did not have or just had SIM cards. The poorest households don't have mobile phones. The households in rural areas don't have mobile phones. And as well, women are less likely to own a mobile phone compared to men. So if you provided access, then you're able to bring this and had voices to the table. Very interesting, in the last year, we have received as an organization, Twaweza, 434 media mentions. Of them, 70% were around this initiative. On a monthly basis, we publish a report on the last Tuesday of the month, and people are able to deliberate on the issues in that space and really create a buzz and ensure that you get an audience over time on the reports that you're launching. Challenges that we are facing in the baseline and in the mobile phone survey, what we tend to realize is in the baseline there's household conflicts. You hand out a mobile phone, as much as a mobile phone look like a small device, it's a problem in other households. There's suspicion of our intention, why are you giving out free things? And then there's network coverage issues, where 12% of the areas we had visited did not have network reception. If you're going to use mobile phones, then that group won't be reached. We have ways in which we have devices that we could really turn that, work on those numbers. On the mobile phone service, people are dropping out. Some of the respondents would die. Phones would get lost. But what is so sad now is, as a result of building this great platform that works and closes this loop between ordinary citizens and the policymakers, you'd realize that governments are also coming up with restrictive legislations. For instance, Tanzania has a statistics and cybercrime bill which deny people to publish statistics without the authorization of the Tanzanian government. It's something you should go out there and read, tweet against it. I think, Danny, you should do that as well. Where are we today, and where do we want to be? This is what we've done, 70% response rates. This is really high for 2 years, 33 data collection rounds, wide topics that have been covered. What is really interesting is the Ministry of Education has reached out to us at a short notice and said, you know what, can we use your platform to get citizens' views on proposed changes in the secondary education system? And this is the type of space we would like to really occupy. A lot of those cool things happening. The future is there. We will be launching a mobile phone handbook, which would almost lay out how you can do this. This is my last slide. And then we'd want to have further engagement. We'd like to reach out to people in this festival and out there. How can we make this data more engaging? How can we ensure that this data really connects with ordinary citizens? We are scaling up. And then we want to push this further. This is an idea that probably started with a few organizations, but how can we set up similar platforms across the continent, across the world, that could be used to generate comparable statistics, that as people are pushing for their own issues at the local level, they can also connect to global issues. And I will end at that point. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you very much, Elvis. So that's all for the presentations for the rest of this session, but thank you very much. I hope you agree that we had a very useful framing of the challenges around accountability from Angelina, particularly some warnings that I see lots of people are tweeting about with regard to data and transparency not necessarily being neutral and in fact being counterproductive in terms of driving or furthering inequality. And then Julia and Elvis gave us some fantastic examples of how we might use data and information to pursue that accountability revolution. We've got about half an hour for questions and discussion. I recognize that although we're an attractive panel, we're a very Anglophone panel. So I'm going to ask anyone who wants to ask a question in Spanish to go first.
Gracias. Gracias. Hello? Hola, gracias. Muchas gracias a todos los ponentes y las ponentes. Mi pregunta es, en este proceso siempre hacemos referencia sobre todo a la importancia social de quien recibe el mensaje, no de las personas que trabajan en los gobiernos, que creo es el primer actor implicado en este reto de transparencia y seguimiento para la rendición de cuentas. Mi pregunta es, desde su perspectiva, ¿qué incentivos creen o qué trabajo directo desde las agendas de gobierno se debe promover para que este talento, que no está muy relacionado con la tecnología ni el reconocimiento de qué significa la información, pueda ser un promotor de Big Data y Open Data? Gracias.
Thank you very much. Other questions? Yeah, in the back there. Thank you.
Mi nombre es Gabriela y quisiera saber si es que ustedes tienen unas sugerencias de cómo poder vincular al gobierno y a la sociedad civil, específicamente para la utilización de datos.
Okay, great. Any more? A gentleman here.
Buenas tardes. Me gustaría saber qué están haciendo con estos datos para movilizar voluntarios y ayudar a la gente, porque creo que la población civil podría actuar en llave con el gobierno.
Okay, thank you. That's a nice, fairly cogent group of questions, and it relates to a question that someone sitting in the front row asked on Twitter, Mark Novotny. This is fantastic, because I could let Mark ask the question, but instead I can read it. No, I can't find it there. Mark, you have to ask the question, because it's about the same sort of issues.
Yes. So thank you. My name is Mark, and my question was, I think if I can remember it correctly now, was to ask around the. We heard earlier that the demand side is lacking a little bit in this accountability revolution. That the supply side, the tools we've heard about today, are so strong. What can we do now to practically sort of mobilize and engage citizens to really make sure that demand is matching the supply?
See, what Twitter makes us lazy. We forget questions. So, a set of questions about how to empower citizens, how to connect citizens with governments, and then how to build the capacity within those institutions to respond to all of that. Who would like to have a go?
I'll take one question or two questions in one. What is the link between government and civil society? How can we grow that space? This is a very interesting space. You know, in one case, we're not supposed to naturally dine together. because you are the watchdog of the government. And in the other case, you want to work with them so that you could have impact, because they also control a large stake on particularly how responsive they can be with a lot of the work that you tend to do. So it's a tight relationship, but it's one that you need to manage very well as civil society organizations. But what I would clearly say, I think like my two main bullet points is what you tend to realize, particularly in the data space, is that most of the times data is supply driven, which I completely concur with you, Mark, where a lot of us are generating data assuming that there's a need for it and there's a gap for it. And you'll also notice that that's, in my presentation, I probably didn't highlight it so heavily here, but it's very crucial for us to reach out to government, for them to look at this as a platform rather than as a tool that we're using to attack them. So again, it will take time to build this relationship. It will take time to also position a lot of these initiatives. What you tend to realize, there's always a pushback in the initial phases, but I think Sarah Ruto, who comes in the 2-minute talks, would also second this, is you realize with a lot of these initiatives in the early years there's rejection, but there's acceptance. Once you go down the road, probably 4 or 5 years down the line, there's clear acceptance. So there's that need for continuous persistence to ensure that your message is heard, and continuously talk until when they're finally heard. And on the second level, what I would really say is, and we shouldn't want to get in so much in that space of dining with the government, but at the same time maintaining that core function of being a watchdog to government, and really putting out clear mechanisms where we can unearth the realities of what is happening in people's lives and bringing them forward to the government for action to be taken upon them.
Wow. Okay, good. I have so many thoughts on this, so I will try to, sum it up. But I think one of the crucial things, and I just had an amazing chat with Alex from the engine room, who's also here in the audience. Hey there. So we were talking about how civil society can engage with government in a way that is both, helpful, constructive, and at the same time we keep that watchdog role that requires a certain distance and space from government. And I think it's really tough, but it's doable. And in a way, a lot of what we're doing, and I can speak on behalf of the organizations that we're working with and on behalf of Sunlight too, a lot of what we're working is defining the kind of loopholes that are prevailing in the government-run systems, and at the same time trying to offer very constructive solutions, tech solutions, to how those loopholes can be, overrun. So, for instance, creating, and that's kind of a dream of mine, but we're working a lot around lobbying disclosure in the U.S., and that's a thing that doesn't exist in other countries, I'm afraid to say, but even the system in the US is pretty broken and has a lot of problems, but at least there is a way to know which companies, which business interest groups are trying to influence the decision-making process. And so what we as civil society can do is to say, here are the problems with the system, and at the same time create solutions for lobbyists to be able to better report on their activities. Like we do, civil society creates a lot of open source technology that can be used by governments too. The relationship is really tricky because we're both critiques and allies at the same time. So I think it requires a lot of diplomatic skills and at the same time a lot of honesty from both sides. And we just have to understand as civil society organizations that the interests of government officials and politicians will always be different from ours, and that's okay. That's how it works. So how we can overrun it is the question. Empowering citizens, I think that that question is great, but it also is very context specific. So we do have amazing initiatives from around the world that might work in one specific context and will never work in another context. So there is a website there's a really amazing organization in Spain, CVO, who created a technology tool, a website, where people can submit information about the relationship between businessmen and politicians in Spain, which is a big issue. It is definitely a big issue in most countries, but the country being run by oligarchies is something very specific for Spain. And people are willing to contribute their time and effort because they are so outraged by how their politics are done. And even though people in other countries are also outraged by how their politics are done, this might not necessarily be the way to engage them. Empowering them is, on the other hand, is a different issue, but I think that the ability to make more informed decisions based on the data that we receive and we can process in better ways is already empowerment. So, I hope it's a step.
Is this working? Yes. Okay. So I'm going to go a little bit out of order, but I think everybody's done that. So, okay. So how can data be used to be more demand-driven? So I mentioned ASER, and I think it's a really an interesting initiative, which is now spread to other countries as well. And it's called UWEZA, I think, in Tanzania or Uganda. And then it's got now there's a pilot project in Mexico, and Hewlett Foundation actually provides a lot of funding for these initiatives. But they're interesting. So ASER started, if I may, just a few minutes. It's a large NGO called Pratam, and they had a lot of these remedial reading programs for kids who couldn't read in school. And they created this very simple testing tool to see their impact of their own work. And they realized that actually they can scale it up. They can use this tool to check for really very basic literacy skills among the general population. So they had gone out and they recruited people from villages, local people. It's typically young people who come and get trained in how to administer these very simple rudimentary testing tools. So it'll be like a paragraph that the kids have to read or 2 lines, and it'll be very clear, if the kid makes 1 mistake, it's this level. If it makes 2 mistakes, it's this level, and so forth. And they go into houses. So it's really an interesting concept. They test kids in their own homes in front of their parents. And the idea being is that a lot of the parents have never themselves gone to school. So they have no idea what to expect from formal schooling. And so some of them can't even read. But the testers will come in, and they come from the local community, so they have respect. And they'll say to the mother or the father, okay, here's a paragraph. Do you think your child who's been in school for 4 or 5 years should be able to read this? And they'll say yes or no, and then they'll administer the test. And the idea that they publish now these annual reports, kind of segregating this data by states and by districts and so forth, but the idea is that process of data collection itself is empowering citizens, right? It's now creating an environment where the parents can say, wait a second, I've been sending my kids to school, how come, for several years, how come they can't read a basic level? So that's an interesting model that's now gone. There's now ASER Pakistan and so forth. I think the most, in terms of empowering, the closer one can get to the grassroots level, the more effective it becomes. When we look at global accountability mechanisms, and we've looked at a number of them, Universal Periodic Review and APRM and so forth, there is data that gets, information that gets submitted by civil society. But if you look to kind of who the civil society is, and it's typically large consortia of very well-funded NGOs, and in some ways they're forced to achieve a consensus on issues that they actually may not all agree on, but that's the only way they can have impact. So a lot of nuances, a lot of details, and a lot of relevance to the very local context becomes lost. And so the more one can bring the local context in, the more we can, we talk about kind of private actors generating data. Well, they should be consulting with the local populations to the extent possible, right? This question of who decides which data to collect, right, should involve people that we think are, affected by whatever problem we think we're trying to measure. The role in the civil society, I'll just say, one of the roles of civil society can actually be unmasking the data, and that is revealing kind of the politics behind the number, right? Demystifying the idea that somehow this number is a fact, right? But actually showing what lies behind it and helping people understand what that data means and helping them understand kind of what the theories of change behind that data is.
Okay, great, thank you very much. Those questions and the responses make me want to ask you guys some questions. Who here is involved in something to do with data for accountability? A project or initiative that involves data and accountability? Okay, keep your hands up, please. And can you keep your hands up, please, if you're explicitly, though, in what you're doing, focusing on empowering and enabling citizens and civil society to analyze that data for accountability, i.e. the demand side of this equation. So put your hand down, i.e. if you're working on the supply side, opening up data, creating more information. Okay, so that's great. Thank you. My theory would be, my observation would be that the vast majority of people in this festival would be working crudely on the supply side, and perhaps in some of the other sessions that are focusing on big data and opening up data, whereas there are relatively few of us, and I would say too few of us, who are working explicitly on the supply side, on the demand side, sorry, oops. So back up please if you work on anything to do with accountability. Who works at the globe, please keep your hand up if you work at the national or local level. And take your hand down if you work at the global level. Okay, so the people who've still got their hand up are the people who are working on local or national accountability mechanisms. Who's working on global accountability mechanisms? Okay, because I think Angelina's point is a very well made one, which is that the really interesting nuance, the real heart of the matter when it comes to data collection is happening at the local and national level. We want people to tell us their stories, to inform our accountability. But what's interesting is that we're seeing an increasing number of global accountability mechanisms, the mother of which is going to be the Sustainable Development Goal framework. And presumably one of our challenges is to connect the dots a little bit, sort of building on those local frameworks while then plugging into the global opportunities for accountability, and that's going to be a substantive challenge, it seems. Okay, we probably have time for one more round of, say, 3 or 4 questions in Spanish, English, or Tamil. I'll translate the Tamil questions.
English.
Okay, good.
My name is Philip. I'm from Kenya. You didn't talk about who works with the state or government, so I'm going to try to pitch that in. We're basically a technology-driven organization, but we've been interestingly put in a space where we actually mediate between civil society and the state. This is why I wanted to contribute into your conversation, where I don't think all of us have to be holding the state to account. I think we can decide to play different roles. Like we find ourselves now increasingly playing that role, so that we actually facilitate a conversation between those who actually hold the state to account and ensuring that the state actually understands what accountability means and is not really somebody against those who are. Secondly, we also simply use simple tools like Twitter just to engage. And we've had 4 interesting discussions where we've not had to build anything special. So I just wanted to share that as a contribution, in the sense that, I mean, you can really use just basic stuff to engage and not necessarily create complex tools to engage citizens.
Okay, thank you. More questions or comments? People are in need of some Colombian coffee. No? We're trending on Twitter. Someone shut down my Twitter access ever since I quoted Mitchell and the awesomeness.
Thank you all to the panelists. As Danny said, the importance of citizen-generated data, or citizens using data to hold governments to account and improve citizen engagement. I just had a quick question to want to know if any of the panelists have had experience on governments pushing back against this data, and what sort of challenge civil society can provide to make sure that our data comes front and center as well.
Okay. Any more before we go back to the panel? Leo? A well-funded international coalition taking lowest common denominator positions.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm Leo Williams. I'm from Beyond 2015. I guess my point was similar to Danny's about the importance of linking up from the national level up to the global level in terms of accountability, especially now that we see lots of member states are pushing back at the global level in terms of talking about accountability and trying to talk just about monitoring and follow-up mechanisms, etc., rather than talking about proper accountability at the global level. So I guess it was a question for Angelo as to whether the research that you guys did focused on kind of moving up the chain from national up to regional and global as well. And like we've been doing a lot of thinking around that, those two levels as well. But it'd be interesting to know if your research focused there as well.
Okay, Mintu, did you have something else?
Great, thanks so much. And this question about global accountability, I hope we can also address in the next session in case we're not able to in this one. Thanks, Leo. Just a question to follow up here. How much of it, when you generate, and this is really a question to you, when you generate some of that data yourself, how much of it then do you find that just because citizens are creating that data, that then the government sort of say, well, hang on a second, actually we may have delegitimized you before, but because you're creating some really good stuff, maybe we'll actually use some of this as well.
Okay, great. Back to the panelists. Lots of good questions there around global, local, beyond accountability, governments pushing back. Angelina, why don't you go first and then we'll go backwards.
Okay. So governments pushing back. So that's actually not always a bad thing. So again, I'll use the India example. So ASER was very popular, became very popular because there wasn't good government data. But there is a big sort of ideological debate in India about what education should be, and there's a strong sense that education also should have a social component to it, right? It's important for social cohesion. So the ASER actually prompted this debate to come to the fore between the people who sort of come from the public management side and thought this was great to have this outcome-based data, and people who thought that this kind of reduces education and moves it away from kind of the original purposes of it all. And as a result, the government decided to improve their data collection process, and so they engaged consultants to help them, get their data methodology up to sort of statistical standards, and kind of encourage different types of data collection processes. So it actually prompted the government to track the data themselves. Now, it's the critiques are, from the bottom up of the government are sort of one way, but the government also has, and that's the global part that comes in, right? So in India, the World Bank, for example, actually needed data, or a lot of donors needed data because they were funding a lot of education initiatives. And in one of their joint monitoring reports, they actually noted that there's now 3 sets of data that actually show very different outcomes on what the state of education in India is. And in some ways, one can say, well, it's sort of like, is it really useful? But in other ways, one can say, well, actually it is, because it helps you triangulate data. It helps you then, it prompts you to look more in depth as to, okay, what are who's studying this? What are they studying? What are they kind of collecting information about, how they're doing it? And that improves the quality of information. That improves sort of the quality of transformation from data to information. And so then the question on kind of the global accountability, in the mechanisms that we looked at, and we looked at some of the peer reviews like the OECD Development Assistance Committee and APRM, but we also looked at some of the reviews that are connected with the Conventions on the Right of the Child and Convention on the Rights of the Disabled People. And we actually found that particularly in the Convention on the Rights of the Disabled People, that there's a lot of engagement with stakeholders. There's a lot of opportunity for stakeholders to contribute both to the set of issues, but also to the ongoing monitoring compliance of the Convention. And I think that's the direction that the SDG should be moving to. As I mentioned, there is a case study that we put in our report, and that's a Committee on Food Security, where actually we think it's a pretty good model, an integrated system that links up the global, national, and local, and brings in the citizen participation quite nicely. Now, they reformed in 2009, so it's sort of a short span to see how successful there actually can be, but but that, I think, is the direction one should go. And I think by the same token, it's the same model that should be applied to accountability of international organizations on the global level, for example. You know, people often say there's an accountability gap. It's not that there's an accountability gap, because those organizations are actually accountable to very powerful state interests. But what there isn't maybe as strong is the accountability of these organizations to the people on the ground that they're supposed to help or affect and so forth. So it's linking that up to the process, I think, is where the SDGs should be going for.
So government's pushing back, and yeah, that leads us to accountability in general. I think I might have a slightly different perspective from many of you here, since we're dealing so much with very controversial information. So information about who is donating to political campaigns, information about who is trying to influence the policymaking process. And that's exactly the kind of information that government will always push back on. And no matter if the data is coming from them or it's citizen-generated data, because we do have some amazing examples on crowdsourcing information about the influence machine. And in both ways, it's just a different type of data, and it's just a different kind of information than, for instance, data about education, environmental issues, etc. So that type of politically really sensitive data will never be, there's never be enough buy-in from politicians to want to publish that data. That said, I think the local level there helps a lot too. And it's not necessarily demand, and again, I might have a different perspective on that than many of you here. I do believe that data collection should be driven by demand, but when it comes to more abstract policymaking processes and the influence machine, people are not interested in that. I come from Hungary, and if I ask 10 people on the streets, 9 will say that information about who's donating to political campaigns is not exciting information. That's not something that they want to know about. Still, that's information that is really important and relevant to keep and hold our government accountable in the original sense. So I do think that a lot of that push about the demand should come from us as intermediaries and us as very important actors in the field, telling exactly what data might be important to disclose there too. And what else did I want to say? And I think that ties to again, making governments understand what accountability is worth for, or what is used for. I think a lot of government officials who would never vote for better disclosure norms, better transparency regulations, or better data publishing understand what accountability is good for. It's just that in many cases, no, they wouldn't. So the problem is there's no buy-in. They don't want that information to be out there. So I think that there's that aspect too that we need to think and talk about when we talk about accountability.
I'll try to be quick. I'm naturally very long. Let me start with government use of the data that we're generating. What really happens? It's not. The uptake is not as much as we would desire for it to happen, and at times some of this uptake can't be quantified in a way as well, because it might just mean by the fact that this report is published and the fact that somebody consumes this information that gives them this position and they use that information to make a decision is not directly linked to your initiative. But what we tend to see, particularly in Tanzania, is one, I think at times we also look at government as government. It depends with the type of country and how specific it is. It really differs from country to country. What you tend to realize is I don't, when I'm looking at the Tanzania, I don't look at government as government, but I look at different government institutions, and is there buying, is there use? It means they can recognize that the Ministry of Education recognizes that there's this platform that can be used to gather data on people's perceptions on a number of education policies, and they sent us a list of questions and they used the platform to gather data. So that means the Ministry of Education used it. We've also done stuff with the National Audit Office of Tanzania on perceptions of their office, on what can be done, how they're publishing their reports, how can those reports be made user-friendly, and that data is gathered and shared. But again, at the same time, you'd find rejection from other government players. This is the situation as of December 31st. The situation as of today has totally changed, and this is completely now linked to the government pushback. Again, the country-specific information becomes really relevant in this particular case, and what I would quickly say, depending on the results of a report that you've published, one group will be offended. Naturally, that's what statistics, that's what numbers tend to do. They'll put you on the opposite side, and they will make you clash. So we've launched at some point back a report on what citizens felt about the draft constitution in Tanzania, and immediately after launching those results, what we found out was the government was really against and immediately at that point they would rush to the methodology, and particularly because we're also trying to incorporate new technology here, and we're using the panel and we're distributing funds. People would want to quickly crack down on the methodology. And then when we published a different report, particularly, should I call it a leadership poll or should I call it a political poll, with the same panel, what you tend to realize that the ruling party is stronger in Tanzania, but the opposition members of parliament then were on the other side. Then what did they simply do? They would say, and they were paid by the government to publish this result. So this is where you find yourself with statistics every time. You'd be on the opposite side. When you read numbers, you should also, you could assess yourself when you get a statistic. What you tend to see is, am I with the majority, am I with the minority? And that will tend to happen a lot of times. So it's something that would continuously happen. But what we are currently now facing is totally different now. It means when you build these good mechanisms of holding governments accountable, the power of the government is in building strong legislation that can crack down on your initiatives. So a lot of my conversations in previous data shift discussions that I have been engaged in, I've been slightly on this side of pushing for more statistical rigor in the approaches that we would use to gather data. But now I find myself that we are all in the same boat with section 37, subsection 5 of our statistics bill reading, any person or agency which without lawful authorization of the National Bureau of Statistics publishes or communicates. So publishing or communicates. So it means the media as well can pick up your stuff. Statistical information which may result to the distortion of facts, commits an offense, and shall be liable on conviction to a fine of not less than around $5,000 or to imprisonment for a term of 12 months or both. And that's where we are, right? It means you can build these mechanisms to hold governments accountable. This is happening in Tanzania. I think there must be other case studies that are happening across the world where now that's clear pushback, you know. If they're going to rubber stamp on a report which is holding them accountable, will you ever publish statistics that would hold governments accountable? That's the question you tend to ask yourself.
Yeah, go on.
So this reminded me of an important point, that is contestation of data. And we particularly in the question of global accountability, is it's part of the role of civil society. It should be to help individuals contest global data, right? To challenge global data. And the example, many of you may know, is, again, the World Bank Doing Business indicator used to have the ease of firing worker factor, right? So if it was easy to fire a person, you'd score higher up because it's based on kind of liberal markets theory. In South Africa, it has very strong post-apartheid labor laws. It presented a huge problem because they kept ranking low because of that. And they tried to mobilize to kind of challenge, to get the World Bank to remove the indicator. And it was only when they were able to gain the support of members of US Congress, did the World Bank eventually remove that factor. So the local contestation of global indicators is really an important part that we haven't really talked much about. And the sort of the legislation is an interesting one because often, at least in our circles, we talk about, hear all these governance effects of data and indicators, and should there be regulation of them, right? Should just like any other product, exams, certain standardized exams are subject to kind of regulation or ethic rules or some standards. Should there be standards governing the production of data or governing the use of data? I think somebody in the earlier panel had mentioned ombudsman for responsible use of data. And then we see kind of this extreme, right, in Tanzania, which is sort of using that claim of, okay, you're producing false data, your data has to be validated by the National Office of Statistics as a way of actually government pushing back on the indicators. So it's another interesting question about how do we kind of balance this idea of being able to have different kinds of data, including data that monitors states, but at the same time safeguarding against some of the unintended effects of the data.
Okay, thank you very much. It's just after 3:30, and so we've run over our time a little bit, but I wanted to say thank you to the panel because our job was to set the scene for this afternoon's discussion. Remember, this is the track on, or this is the stage about data accountability and citizen engagement. And what I've heard, and if I can indulge you with what I think we heard, it was right at the end, what happens when data meets power, when statistics meet politics, is what we've just been talking about. And in a way, throughout the presentations, I heard three aspects or facets of that encounter between the data revolution and the accountability revolution that are fascinating and really difficult. One is that between demand and supply, that it's not good enough just to produce loads more data if people aren't using it to change their lives and make it a better tomorrow. The second is the global local, and I think I work for a global network, and so we're really engaged in some of these global discussions, and we see huge potential, for example, in the SDG framework, to boost and resource local accountability. But if you do that in a really clumsy way, as we've heard, it's just so detached from the lived experiences of so many people. And then the third facet, I suppose, is between action and reaction. That, as we've just heard from Elvis, that those of us who do want to push on the sort of data agenda will find, in some cases, we're winning the argument. That, if you are dining with the government or engaging people, that now that you have the power of information in your hands, your argument becomes all that more compelling. But unfortunately, in so many parts of the world, governments are simply reacting by making life harder for us, by threatening a new law like this, or just beating up people or putting them in prison. So I think the demand and supply, the local, global, the action, reaction are three facets of this transition mechanism or transmission mechanism between the data revolution and the accountability revolution. I think we also heard lots of worrying signs about, I was particularly taken, Angelina, by your point that transparency may in fact favor those with power and resources. And I think that's an amazing warning for all of us who need to understand the power and implications of this. But also around the normative framing, the British caste example of how those of us who are engaged in the data revolution actually could be doing long-term damage in the sort of normative way in which we might define or categorize things out there in the world. But to finish on a happy note before we go to coffee, I think I also heard some really promising signs about the disruption that we can all engage in amidst those transmission mechanisms. So whether that's empowering people through the very act of data collection, that no longer are we people with clipboards from the National Statistic Office turning up to collect information about people, but we are citizens, equal partners, equal players in a collective accountability pursuit. And we're doing this because we want to change the world, not just because we want to count the world. And in that process, I think we can empower people. I think that I love this idea of unmasking the assumptions behind data. And I saw some tweets about that as well. And maybe there's something particularly disruptive that we can do to turn some of that normative categorization and framing on its head. So amidst all of the dangers that we've heard a lot about, I think there's amazing things to be particularly optimistic about. what you need to be optimistic about is that you've got 20 minutes for coffee, and then after that, we're going to hear something like 8 different presentations of 8 new amazing initiatives that are happening out there, and then we'll follow that up with a closing panel. So thank you very much. Enjoy your coffee. We'll be back here soon.
Welcome back. Did you have a good afternoon or a good day so far? I love the Colombian hospitality. It's lovely. It's like in my hometown in Senegal. We love people. We give them food, drink, wine. And then we take out time because time is not an emergency. It's not a problem. So we're very happy to have you here again. This is an amazing session. It's very fast, but it's very action-driven. So my name is Mariam Jam, and I'll be chairing this. I'm from Africa Gathering. And we have amazing people here that will take action for the next couple of days and in the future as well. So I'm going to call them, and they have 2 minutes to tell us how wonderful they are doing and they will be doing. And they will have time to give you the business card later to network and take actions. As Claire said this morning, it's all about actions. We don't want to come here, talk, and leave. We want to make sure there are some actions being taken afterward. So it's all action-driven in the next half an hour. Are you in? You say yes! Right, okay, let's do it, because these guys are like really action people. So I'm going to call now Zach Brisson, and he's from the Reboot. Zach, the session is all yours.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So, slides. Great. I want you to imagine for a minute that you're an officer in charge at a healthcare clinic in rural Nigeria. Your work is stressful. You chronically suffer from a lack of time and resources necessary to deliver care the way you'd like to. You're also part of a new performance-based financing initiative where your funding is tied to various evaluations of your performance. Now imagine that the World Bank and my firm Reboot show up at your doorstep to say that we are going to introduce another new program that integrates patient feedback on the quality of your care into your performance evaluations. In a snapshot, that was the year in the life of Salisu Ibrahim, who's sitting behind me. His facility was one of 12 that participated in the recent pilot of My Voice, an SMS feedback tool and accompanying program meant to try to improve service delivery through the empowerment of citizen voices. Now, you might be wondering why I'm starting by telling a story about a service provider rather than the citizens whose voices we were trying to amplify. Well, the answer lies in my trying to articulate 2 principles that we think are key to designing effective accountability loops. The first of those is to design for all users, not just your end users. Accountability is the product of the complex interplay between citizens and governments, but neither of those groups is a monolith. Rather, they represent a diverse ecosystem of actors with a range of capabilities, incentives, and perspectives. That's why we designed My Voice closely with Salisu and other OICs so that it reflected their needs and not just those of end users. The second principle is that accountability is about communications, not punishment. For feedback to matter, both sides of the equation have to have some measure of buy-in and trust in the feedback. For end users, they have to have trust that their feedback will matter. And for service providers and governments, they have to believe in the feedback so that they respond to it and act on it. That can be difficult to achieve, particularly in a context like rural Nigeria. But in this case, fortunately, it worked. Salisu became a big supporter of My Voice. He began to see the patient feedback as a tool for managing issues at his clinic. For example, he was able to take patient complaints about the clinic closing early at night to his local government council, where he got funding to buy a generator and is now keeping the clinic open later at night. Getting there is why we talk about My Voice not purely as a tool, but as a program, because data and technology alone will not create accountability or change. They have to be layered with nuanced programmatic interventions that take into account the feedback and needs of all stakeholders. Because after all, if we're not accountable to feedback as program designers, how can we expect anyone else to be? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zach. Thank you. So you will help me keep the time. They've got 2 minutes, literally 2 minutes. So the person who's going to keep the 2 minutes probably will win. You never know. So the next person is Mario Rosette from Wingu. Mariette.
¿Se escucha así, no? Me voy a gastar los primeros 30 segundos en que ustedes se pongan los auriculares. Tengo solo 2 minutos, así que voy a intentar ser bastante eficaz. Vengo a hablarles de WINGU y de un proyecto en particular. WINGU es una organización sin fines de lucro, basada en Argentina y en México, cuya misión es potenciar el trabajo de muchísimas otras ONGs de toda Latinoamérica a través de la incorporación de tecnología y metodologías ágiles a sus procesos y a su comunicación. Particularmente les quería hablar del FITS. El FITS es una respuesta a uno de los problemas que se habló mucho durante el día de hoy, que es que en este tipo de eventos somos siempre las mismas personas, que las organizaciones que están realmente haciendo cosas interesantes con datos son esas internacionales y con llegada, esos monstruos de la sociedad civil. Y lo que nosotros queremos hacer a través de este festival es acercar la innovación y la tecnología y los datos a organizaciones medianas y pequeñas de Argentina, de México y, por qué no, de Colombia. La idea de este festival es convocar e invitar a 400 organizaciones de este estilo. Ya lo hemos hecho en formatos similares en Argentina en el pasado y este año ya está confirmado en junio, lo vamos a hacer en Argentina y en julio en México. Invitaremos a organizaciones de la sociedad civil, por supuesto, que son los primeros destinatarios del trabajo que hacemos. Esa es la idea, poder transformarlas con el uso de la tecnología y sobre todo de los datos. Pero también invitaremos a gobiernos, corporaciones tecnológicas y universidades a ser parte de esto. Así que con mucho entusiasmo lo haremos también acá en Colombia en el mes de octubre. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Mario. Thank you. So all the initiatives you see are new data-driven led initiatives. The next person is Natalia Carrera from UNDP, Colombia. And Natalia will speak in Spanish, I think. Sorry, it's my mistake. It's Sarah Ruto. Sarah! Welcome, Sarah. She's actually... My apologies, Sarah.
Thank you. Citizen-led assessments. Imagine, if you will, a Chinese restaurant. I don't know, how many of you have been to a Chinese restaurant? And we like to think of ourselves as having spread in a Chinese restaurant model. So we started in India, and those of you who are here in the first session may have heard a little bit about us. In India, in an organization called Pratham, who are leading the annual Status of Education report known as ASER. And they have done the citizen-led process for 10 years. Then 5 years ago, we heard about them in East Africa, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, and we started it. And then West Africa followed. Even here in Latin America, we have MIA, Mexico, and in Nigeria. What do? It is very simple. Every year, we assess collectively over about 1 million children, one-to-one, in the household, where we train volunteers and take what is traditionally known to be a schooling affair to the households. And there is power when data or evidence is collected and the people who are supposed to use it actually see it being generated. So unlike other people who aggregate data going up, we like to see and say that our data first gets used down there at the family level, where a parent sees whether their child can read or not, and then they can take decisions based on that. So we'd like to say in the citizen-led process that we liberate data in ways that perhaps have not been seen before, but it's actually common sense, because data needs to be useful first and foremost to the person who is giving it, not to the person who wants to use it for something else. So we make it meaningful by using people who, homes, and the very people who that data, they're giving it up, it becomes meaningful to them. And the tests are very simple, and anybody can use it, the tests, in order to make use for them. And this evidence thereafter is made useful in all ways possible. It comes alive because we talk about it on radio, in languages that citizens use, not just in other elitist languages that are used by the policymakers. And my 2 minutes are up. So come more and learn about the Chinese model and we now call ourselves the PAL network. Thank you.
Wow, that's powerful. So you can see how powerful the 2 minutes are. So they're just amazing. Next will be Natalia Carrera. Sorry about your name earlier.
Bueno, hola, vamos a seguir con la diversidad español-inglés. Vengo acá para presentarles una nueva iniciativa del PNUD con todas esas organizaciones que ven abajo, que son organizaciones de la sociedad civil, filantropía, y se llama la Plataforma de Colaboración para la Filantropía y la Inversión Social Privada en Colombia y otros 3 países. Ustedes se preguntarán por qué la filantropía, por qué las Naciones Unidas, por qué estamos en esta iniciativa para crear una plataforma con estos datos. Lo primero es que, como todos sabemos, el desarrollo no es un tema solamente de los gobiernos, no es suficiente ni tienen la capacidad suficiente los gobiernos para solucionar los problemas tan grandes que nos aquejan. Y el tema de la filantropía o las organizaciones filantrópicas, con todos los matices que pueden tener en cada país, lo que significa la filantropía, están haciendo un aporte fundamental al desarrollo. Que no es un tema solamente de dinero, que no es un tema solamente de aportes, es un tema también de intercambio de conocimientos, un tema también de generación de capacidades y sobre todo también un tema de generación de información para ver cómo están funcionando estos flujos de filantropía para el desarrollo. Todos sabemos que la filantropía también está caminando a nuevas formas de hacerse, digamos la forma tradicional de hacer filantropía ha encontrado otros nichos más interesantes o digamos con nuevas posibilidades y en eso estamos avanzando en un esquema mucho más sistémico en donde podamos ver quién aporta a qué. En términos muy generales, esta es una plataforma que se está construyendo, es una iniciativa muy reciente. Naciones Unidas quería conocer mejor la filantropía y cómo estaba aportando y la filantropía seguramente estaba aportando al desarrollo y a la Agenda Global de Desarrollo sin saberlo tanto, así que queremos alinear estos dos objetivos. Esto es básicamente lo que va a tener la plataforma, va a tener un espacio para ver los flujos de dinero de la filantropía hacia el desarrollo, un espacio para compartir conocimiento y compartir historias, va a tener también un seguimiento a los ODM y a los ODS en su transición y muy enfocado hacia lo local también, obviamente con toda la sombrilla de la filantropía. También vamos a querer alinear mucho todo el trabajo de la filantropía y la inversión social privada con las prioridades del gobierno, las prioridades de Naciones Unidas. Esta mañana comentaban que Colombia creó una comisión de alto nivel para el desarrollo de los SDGs, así que ahí tenemos mucho trabajo por hacer. Obviamente va a ser un espacio para crear mejores y más inteligentes alianzas y allá está toda la información si quieren saber algo más. Gracias.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Natalia. Next, we have Mark Novotny. Hi, Mark.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Novotny, and I'm the Policy and Practice Director at Restless Development. A year and a half ago, one of our youth advocates stood up to the high-level panel for the Sustainable Development Goals and said that whatever's in the goals, whether that's health, employment, education, what ultimately matters is more how young people are going to hold their governments to account for the effective delivery of the SDGs over the next few years. Now that sparked for us a big idea, and our hypothesis is this, that if you equip and empower young people with the skills to use, analyze and generate data on the issues that affect their lives, then they'll use it to hold governments to account. I'm delighted sort of 18 months later now, on behalf of Restless Development, the youth-led development agency, which is putting young people at the forefront of change and development, to be launching the first full pilot phase of the big idea. And we'll be doing this over the year that's coming, particularly in Ghana, where we'll be working with hundreds of young people to look at the National Youth Bill, in Tanzania, where we'll be working with them to look at the informal sector and youth unemployment, and in Nepal, where we'll be looking at local planning processes and youth participation in those. Now, that's for us, part of sparking a wider movement on youth-led accountability, and we think that we're going to need to invest in young people and support them to get that global movement. Now, I kind of want to conclude by asking you to join with us and work with us on this. Restless Development can't and shouldn't be doing this alone. And so we'd like you to urge you to come on board with the growing number of partners that are getting behind the big idea. So please come and see our booth in the Innovation Fair, check out our website or get in touch, and we'd be delighted for you to hopefully become part of this big idea to put young people at the heart of monitoring the SDGs.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you so much. Really amazing project so far. Next, we have Mitchell Toomey.
Hello. Let's see. Oops. This is not counting my time, I'm sure. So
you never know. I'm counting.
Anyway, my name is Mitchell Toomey, and I'm going to talk about a project called My World. Some of you may have heard of My World. It's a survey run by the UN to elicit citizen feedback and inputs into the development of the SDG agenda. This has been going on for a little while now. World leaders wanted to know what citizens want, so we helped decide on a set of questions to ask or a set of options that people could choose from based on an exhaustive policy conversation that resulted in 16 possible options. We asked citizens to choose 6. So this was a survey that was done online via SMS and via paper. We tried everything. We didn't want to choose a specific methodology. Our mantra was just get the votes, just get the voices. We ended up getting 7 million voices or votes, 1 million of them on websites, 500,000 of them via SMS, but 5.5 million via paper, via civil society partners and organizations who went out into their communities with an exercise that they could do in partnership with the UN. So it wasn't just an extractive exercise of getting data out of the community, but it was an opportunity for the conversation to happen within the community, and as a side effect, the world leaders got good data. So there was a demand already from world leaders to have this information. The supply was actually from citizens. So when we talked earlier today about supply and demand, this is the opposite framework. So here we are, we have sat with the 7 million now. Member states and heads of state have referenced it in their speeches. It's been in major media, and we've had the effect, we believe, of influencing a very ambitious agenda by showing citizens we're interested in all 17 of the options presented. So now what do? Well, we take that same network of over 1,000 partners who ended up doing very localized survey activities that we aggregated in, and we asked them to go out again, once the goals have been decided, to go back into their communities, to exercise the survey again, but in this case talk about priorities and satisfaction. And this is the accountability conversation that we might have. So this is our first slide, and I'm not going to take 2 more minutes of your time. But the next slide, if you may, is talking about where we're going to go from here. So there's a great network out there of people who've been activated. They didn't know what question to ask. They wanted to get involved in the data revolution, but they didn't quite know how. We gave them well-vetted questions and gave them the freedom to go out and do it as any way they wanted to. They came back with surprising and fascinating results from different communities from all corners of society. So now we take that, one more back, we take the same initiative and that community of very local actors and ask them again to go out once the goals have been determined to start the process of baselining in their communities as to what priorities should be tackled first within each community, within each city, and within each state. And so not just to report back to the UN, but to take that exercise and also determine what they want from their local communities. So by taking the backseat in the UN and just collecting the data that they were using for their own purposes, we ended up with a valuable global good at the global level, but the real value is at the local level. So small is bigger than big. In big data, it's a collection of small pieces of data, and the small pieces of data are what really matters. The big picture will only give policymakers a basic direction to go in, but what really matters is the individual needs in their own community. So I invite you to join us tomorrow morning at 9:30. We're going to go into a lot of detail about what we learned trying to collect voices over SMS, call-in numbers, paper ballots, and aggregate them all into one picture for world leaders. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. We're just having some little technical problems, but the next person on stage is Erika Hagen.
Is there any way you could put the slide up? No? Okay, give me 5 seconds. No, I want the slide.
There's always technical problems in data events, you know? Always.
I know.
We haven't got the technology right yet. Maybe soon.
I'll show it to you.
Anyway, we're running late. There's a Africa event happening soon. There's an Africa event we need to go to because this one has been running. People are waiting, and we are on the panel, but we are here. So,
yay! Okay, thanks for being patient. I really wanted to actually show you a screenshot from the website. This is Open Schools Kenya, and my partners and I have been working on this the past year. I'm from Ground Truth Initiative, and in 2009 we started the Map Kibera project, where citizens of the Kibera slum area in Nairobi mapped their own community using GPS devices and OpenStreetMap open data software. And on Open Schools Kenya, which we've recently launched, we're partnering with Development Gateway as well to create this site of schools data. And basically what the members of the project have done, and they're also the same residents of Kibera, go to every single school in Kibera. If you can believe it, there's 350 schools, it turns out, in 2.5 square kilometers. That's how dense. This is an image of, satellite image of Kibera. That's how dense it is and how much need there is for education that's not being served by the government. And so besides that, they collected all kinds of data about each school, number of teachers, number of students, programs, costs to attend each school, and most of these are informal, small schools. So this is information that people simply didn't have about the education landscape in Kibera. But I think what's most exciting about it is that through doing so, we sort of built a network between our citizen data gatherers, who are, again, familiar people, residents of the community, and each school. So as they go there and talk to people at the school, they build that sort of network, and they're trusted intermediaries of information. So what this means is that later, they can go to the page, they can say, hey, our school has an update. They can even call them, say, hey, our school has fewer students or more students, or a teacher was added or dropped. And this is the kind of thing that they're doing because they're very aware of this site. They each have a profile page, and they look at it and they say, hey, there's something incorrect. So it's a sustainable process of citizen data generation. With this pilot, we hope to grow to cover Kenya, therefore the name Open Schools Kenya, and hopefully beyond.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. The next person will be Kate Higgins from Civicus.
Okay, hi everyone. We tested this multiple times this morning, but we still have a little bit of a glitch. I'm Kate Higgins, and I work for Civicus. I'm leading an initiative called the Data Shift. We're doing this in partnership with the Engine Room, who are here, and Wingu, who are helping us with this wonderful tech support. So this is so it's really great to be here. The Data Shift has one objective, which is to build the confidence and capacity of civil society organizations to produce and generate citizen-generated data, to monitor development, to promote sustainability, and to demand accountability. So that's the one thing the Data Shift is about. We're rolling out in 2 years, this year and next year. We have 3 locations: Nepal, our second location is Tanzania and Kenya, and the third location is Argentina. We have 4 objectives. The first is to increase the coverage of citizen-generated data initiatives. The second is to enhance the credibility of citizen-generated data. The third is to build the comparability dimension of citizen-generated data. And the fourth is to use citizen-generated data in campaigning. We have 5 work streams. We're developing a global knowledge hub. We're building and empowering Data Shift ambassadors who will work in all of our pilot countries. We are doing work on particular themes to get some depth and develop our technical capacity around particular SDG themes. We are fundraising for a Data Shift fund to provide resources to civil society organizations to build their capacity around citizen-generated data. And we are going to build a Data Shift dashboard and hopefully work with a number of you to use citizen-generated data to support shadow reporting of the SDGs. Something that we have launched today that we're really excited about is a mapping visualization of over 50 citizen-generated data initiatives in the world. Go to our website, www.thedatashift.org. It's mapped by SDGs, the 17 proposed SDGs. You can identify the platforms that have been used to build these citizen-generated data initiatives, the strategies that people have taken, and then you can deep dive around these 50 initiatives to find out how they collected the data, whether it was verified, what they were targeting, what they were seeking to do. So we really encourage you to partner with us, come and talk to us. We'll be here for the next 3 days. And if you have an initiative that you'd like to be featured on our platform, please let us know. Thanks.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you so much. So the next person on stage, Mariela Di Comio.
Can you hear me well? Yes, okay. So let me see if this works. Which one is this? Yes, that's the right one. Okay, hello everybody. So at Development Initiatives, we believe that information is power. Our mission is to enable evidence-based decisions that deliver more effective use of resources to end poverty. The DI shares the belief that the world can end poverty by 2030. It is not a matter of if, but it's a matter of when. The DI's contribution to ending poverty is to ensure that no one is left behind and is focused on information to promote change. But information only leads to change if people are able to access, understand, and apply it. And this is where the Development Data Hub platform comes in. We have developed a new, free, online, comprehensive, and open access hub which brings together in one place resources flow data alongside poverty, social, and vulnerability indicators. It brings together many data that actually already exist, but that are from credible sources such as the World Bank, USAID, the UN, the IMF, and also national budgets. The Data Hub enables to dig into this through interactive maps, visualizations, and charts. You can control the journey you take through the data. I think this reflects the challenges we have in making the data revolution happen, so let's go ahead with this. Okay, so you can control the data journey you take and to get the answers you need to understand what is going on between and across developed and developing countries. The data is available for download where this is possible, and the tool is absolutely free to use. The Development Data Hub is for everyone that makes decisions about allocating resources to achieve the ambition of ending poverty. This is international organizations, civil society, but also national governments. The website is now live. It has been launched the last week, and it's available at devinit.org/data. And this is the very beginning of a journey, and I think it would be very interesting to know for you if you go online to see what information is useful and how we can improve the platform to make it more relevant to your work. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I'm Kate Higgins, I'm from Civicus, and Mariem from the Africa Gathering has had to go to another panel. We're going to keep things moving. We have Jill Armstrong from the World Bank India next. Let's have another round of applause for everyone. This has been a lot of effort. People have done a good job here.
Great, thanks very much. It's great to be with you here and to share with you an interactive app that we built for our World Bank program in India, and I wanted to show it with you. It's meant to be interactive and it's meant to be visual. So the visual is there. And I wish we could do it interactively, but we'll get to that in a sec. We launched this last year. It was our first version, Open Data, Open India. And it was an interactive data visualization that presents all of our program. That includes the World Bank and our International Finance Corporation, which deals with the private sector, through the lens of our country partnership strategy. Usually it's a document that sits on a bookshelf, but we wanted to take it off and make it come alive. So for Open India 1.0, transparency was the key for this app. It was built on a foundation of open data, and we built a data set of over 100 subnational indicators that was resident on our colleagues' database. And it was our first step to contributing to the call for a data revolution for sustainable development. Users can go in and play with it. In fact, we told people to go and play, and it was almost childlike, and you'll be able to see this interaction upstairs. And it combined the financing of the World Bank Group along with our knowledge to address the most pressing issues in India. Most importantly, what this shows is the progress that we're making. It actually embeds the results framework right through from the strategy to the indicators to the projects that are part of our program. It helps us focus on whether we're doing the right shifts as we move toward low-income states in India, whether we're focusing on gender the way we've said we are, and what the results are that we're trying to achieve. So we received great feedback on version 1.0, but we always knew that we wanted to do something more accountable in version 2.0. So version 2.0 is what you see on the screen in terms of its capabilities, and accountability was the real shift that we reached in version 2.0. Providing civil societies, beneficiaries, with an interactive way of coming back and giving us feedback on the updates that we're being able to show, the project-level grievance mechanisms that are built into all of our projects on the project databases, and finally to embed a social media interactive Facebook page for engaging on individual project level. So that's a very quick tour. I'd love to be able to show it to you, but if you come upstairs to the Innovations Fair, we'd love to talk to you about it then. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Jill. I think that's a good reminder. The Innovations Fair has a lot of this stuff. So go to the Innovations Fair, second floor, and you can talk to a lot of these people about the really exciting work they're doing. Okay, we next have Matthew Martin from Development Finance International.
Yes, before I started. Hi, I'm here to tell you about a joint initiative, which is between us and Oxfam International and the International Budget Partnership. And Publish What You Fund, and was also signed on to by 70 other civil society organizations last year. And why have we got this initiative? It's to track the inputs that are going into the SDGs so we know whether we might have any results at the end of the process in a few years. During the MDGs, we had unfortunately very little information at all on what was being spent by governments to reach the goals, or on the revenue or financing which was necessary to get that spending made. And we did some analysis jointly as a set of organizations last year using new data sets which showed that when you have more transparent information, you have higher spending and you have greater MDG results. So therefore, this type of data can be a really good early warning predictor of progress for the SDGs. So we created a coalition of 70 CSOs from 50 countries to lobby for making sure that all of there's national and global level monitoring of the SDGs, of the budget inputs that go into them. And this builds on many country-level initiatives by IBP, Oxfam, and lots of other organizations, some present in this room, for transparency and accountability on budgets across the world. And we want to move forward to agree country-level compacts to have that set in stone that there will be great budget accountability and transparency across the world, because as we heard in the previous session, sometimes that can go backwards when you think you're making progress. Our contribution to this is something called Government Spending Watch, where through about $400,000 worth of money from various NGOs and UN organizations in the last couple of years, we've managed to increase the transparency of what's being spent on the MDGs across 70 countries from about 45% of the data you need to about 60% in 3 years. So very low cost as well as quick. And we're asking for 4 sets of quick wins: publishing all the budget-related documents and data that essentially most governments already produce; publishing spending data which really tracks what's going to each individual SDG and also looks at beneficiaries and results so that we can combat inequality across the world and make sure nobody's left behind; publishing revenue data to show that governments are fighting inequality through progressive taxes, eliminating tax exemptions for companies and fighting tax evasion; publishing financing data on aid, debt and public-private partnerships and the documents underlying them, the loans and contracts, to show that funders are providing sufficient and sustainable finance. We've had a really positive response to all of this from developing countries who want to put this data in the public domain, from development partners who want to fund it. We're going to be showing you much more about this in one of the side events at 11:30 tomorrow. I put 11 there. Maybe I just wanted to encourage you all to come early. 11:30 tomorrow, so please join us to hear more. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thanks so much. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. We did start late, so I think everyone did a great job at sticking pretty well to the 2 minutes. We've been all over the world. We've looked at a whole lot of different issues. Civicus is thrilled to be part of this with UNDP and Africa Gathering. So another round of applause for the wonderful 2-minute team. And we're transitioning right now into our final session, which will be chaired by Paul Ladd from UNDP, where we're going to try and identify what some collective priorities for us can be to make sure that the data revolution and the post-2015 agenda has citizens and accountability at the absolute core. So please just hang around for a quick transition, and we'll be getting started to make sure we can finish right on 6 for the reception. Thanks, everyone.
Into 1 hour, but we're going to continue the conversation around how to promote and continue to promote citizens' engagement and citizens-led accountability for the monitoring of progress on the post-2015 agenda. So we've got a great panel. I think I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves so that I don't have to talk all the time. Would that be okay? And then, so no questions for the time being, but if you can just introduce yourself, where you come from, what you've been working on.
I'm going to speak in Spanish, so if anybody wants to listen to the translation. Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Catalina Escobar, yo soy directora y cofundadora de Macaya, una entidad que se dedica a fortalecer otras organizaciones de la sociedad civil y gobiernos locales, y también represento la iniciativa Beyond Access. Es una iniciativa financiada por la Fundación Bill y Melinda Gates y se dedica a fomentar las bibliotecas públicas como agentes de desarrollo social y económico, y buscamos que las bibliotecas públicas sean ese espacio donde los ciudadanos acceden a la información, al conocimiento, y donde podrán tener la capacidad de monitorear todo este progreso de indicadores, y donde podrán hoy en día pueden efectivamente acceder a la información y los datos que se están diseñando y publicando. Muchas gracias.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. Mintu Pham from the UN Foundation, and I'm based in New York. I lead the foundation's work to support the UN process to develop the next set of development goals and the follow-up, as well as the financing. My role is to try to help support and improve the negotiating environment so that we get a better, more focused agenda and a set of financing initiatives that will really help us deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. And in that process, I try to connect civil society voices, developing country voices, and export voices to inform the discussions in New York.
Hi. My name is Mushiri Nyaga. I'm from Nairobi, Kenya. I'm with the Local Development Research Institute. And our work is focused on domesticating international development initiatives. So the SDGs, for instance, or Africa's Agenda 2063, what will it look like when you go down to the subnational level, and what will it mean? So we work with African Union member states and institutions and civil society organizations that are active on the continent.
Hola, buenas tardes. Soy Eduardo Clark. Yo soy el director de investigación y análisis de datos en la oficina del presidente de México. Y lidereo un proyecto que tenemos que se llama Datos para el Desarrollo, en el cual tratamos de usar información gubernamental y privada para desarrollar y evaluar política pública enfocada en desarrollo social en México.
Questions for our session now are: how do we promote meaningful citizens' engagement, and what are the opportunities for collaboration across our different organizations and platforms? So if you don't mind, Mintu, I'll start with you, please. How is the topic of accountability, or monitoring, review, follow-up, any of the softer terms, how's that faring in the New York negotiating context? And then what are some of the opportunities that you see for citizen engagement and accountability?
Okay, hi. Thanks, Paul. To summarize the sort of challenges and opportunity, I'm going to borrow a phrase that Danny mentioned in the first session here. I think the challenge is the accountability revolution. I think the opportunity is the data revolution. Maybe to give a bit more nuance there, the discussions in New York, right now, no one is using the term accountability. And I don't know if Angelina is still in the room here. But her definition of accountability this morning, and I'm just going to repeat it very quickly, is it's a relationship of power. It's about making sure that people answer, that governments and others answer, act, accept responsibility, and are subject to sanction and remedy. You can see why accountability might not be well received by the governments that are agreeing to the next set of the post-2015 agenda here. Instead, they're calling it follow-up and review. We're not even using the term monitoring, much less the term accountability. And as I said, I think when you look at what accountability actually means, you can start to see why that is. And in part, the countries that are, and I'm speaking about this in my own personal capacity, so please don't blame the UN Foundation, the countries that are mostly against using terms like accountability and monitoring are actually a lot of the developing countries, in part because accountability in the UN context means government-to-government accountability. And what I think you all are really interested in is government-to-citizen accountability. And so I think trying to define that a little bit better and sift through this is really important. It's really hard for governments to accept accountability when you're looking at an agenda that's made up at this point of 17 goals and 169 targets. Someone mentioned the Economist article earlier today. I think you have to realize that the Sustainable Development Goals, as they've been formulated, went through a process of real inclusiveness. People like Paul Ladd, you heard Mitchell mention My World earlier today, people like Paul Ladd putting in place consultations globally, massive consultations over the last couple of years. When you try to bring in more actors, you're going to get a lot more issues and you're going to get 169 targets. What that means, though, is not that we then try to get rid of certain things, but instead it means we have to work harder together to hold our governments accountable for that, for the promises that they make, so that accountability is not a bad word when you get to the UN. And I think that both has to happen at the national level, getting government to citizen accountability, and especially the feedback loop when you get to the global level, citizen to global level accountability, and government-to-government accountability. And I think that data and transparency and some of the initiatives that you heard on this stage a few minutes ago are going to be really, really important to getting us there.
So thank you, Mintu. That's great to kick us off. Before I go to the other panels, I see Dozie. Dozie is here, right? And you said data is the opportunity, accountability is the challenge. So Dozie, the African data consensus was agreed recently. Do you see any opportunities for strengthening engagement and accountability because of that agreement on data?
Yes, thank you very much. I see that because we intentionally decided to define a data revolution in terms of processes rather than just the existence of data in, like Danny said earlier, data in servers in Silicon Valley. We'll say it's the process of us doing something that will eventually allow us, among other things, for citizens to be engaged in what their governments are doing for them. We didn't use the word accountability for exactly the same reason you talked about it. It's not a dirty word, but governments will shut you down once you say accountability up front. So we say, okay, let's get citizen engagement in the things that are being done for their own good. And also for us to be able to own and control the narrative. So we see a good opportunity for us in that. And one thing we try to do, we try to define a concept of data community, because it's always the producers consulting the users and getting feedback. We say, no, let everybody be members of a data community that will together define from their own communities how they relate to data and tell us what they want to see in data being available for them to do their jobs better. So I see a lot of opportunity for us there.
Great, thank you. Perhaps then I'll turn to Muchiri, if I may. Do you see other examples or opportunities at the regional level for collaboration on citizen engagement and
accountability?
Thank you, Paul. But yes, I do see a number of opportunities, and I think also those here might be being a bit humble about the Africa Data Consensus. Right now provides us with an immense opportunity. I think for organizations that didn't have an entry point and didn't understand how to engage with the African Union space and bring the conversation around data to the table, that's presented an easy entry, and I think that has done a great deal. Then of course, post Addis, there's some things that have been happening. So after the Africa Data Consensus emerged from this high-level conference that was held in Addis, organized by ECA and the African Union and the African Development Bank. And the outcome of that has been some consultations that have been happening outside of that space. In Kenya, there's already a convening of civil society organizations, and now probably a more broader convening that's probably starting this week to begin to understand how to give the Africa Data Consensus life. And it's very likely that that is going to be replicated across a number of African countries. Then, of course, we have the first 10-year plan for Africa's Agenda 2063. So some of you might not know about it, but we have the SDGs as this conversation we're having for post-2015 at the global level. But Africa has a 50-year vision and plan. And that 50-year vision and plan has phases, and the first phase is the first 10 years. And there's a regional consultation process going that's about to start, or is in play. I forget at what point the process is, but that gives civil society organizations an entry point to organize and speak into that process so that we can have data and the capacities around it getting a stronger place at the table. And then, of course, there are the regional consultations that are going to be that have been happening a little bit around the financing for development. There is the national statistics, national strategies for development of statistics. Those have national consultations going on. There are organizations that have been convening around them. For those of you working in Africa, there's the Africa Working Group, the Africa CSO Working Group on post-2015 that's doing a lot of work in adding value to what member states are able to bring to the table at the negotiations in New York. They're adding their voice to the financing for development conversations as well. And they provide an opportunity for us to speak into that. So this and a number of other points of entry allow us as civil society organizations to organize and to aggregate our feedback and put it on the table. And I think that's a fantastic step, at least at the regional level. But I think this conversation of accountability also speaks to one of the areas that's making things a bit, people a bit nervous. You know, Paul, I know this is a bit of a rabbit trail, but there's the risk of a dysfunctional asymmetry in accountability. And this is mostly because of the different kinds of actors that Angelina mentioned earlier. You have state to state, some level of accountability there. You have state to citizen. You have states to donors. They're getting money, you know, they're expecting some return of some sort. And the challenge here is when you start putting pressure on the state to be more accountable to its citizens, that is happening in a context where you know, Bretton Woods institutions are asking for more information. But this mutual accountability, the term was being bandied around quite a bit. We're using it, we're expecting to see something happen. It kind of implies that these multilateral institutions, the donor institutions, are also going to be accountable to member states. And we're not sure what that would look like because it's not been the norm. We're talking about a UN that is fit for purpose in the post-2015. How will a United Nations system be accountable to the citizens of the member states or to the member states themselves? What kind of openness, what kind of data is the United Nations system going to be putting out about itself to the rest of the space? So I think the complexity of dealing with the accountability question, especially at a global level, is not going to get any easier. But it gives us an opportunity to push local agendas and get some local traction happening around our own indigenous accountability mechanisms. because at the local level, I really don't care much for what my government is saying to the Bretton Woods institutions. It's not a big priority for me. But for service delivery, what my government is making, what promises my government is making about what the state of healthcare is going to be at the hospital, around the corner, that matters. So that's the level at which I believe we should take advantage at this point to drive the question around data and make citizen engagement more real, so that it's not abstract about global, about the UN, about the AU, but it's down here where my children are going to school.
So I think that's a good segue. So let's switch regions. Let's come directly to Mexico. A broad question to begin with, Eduardo. So your responsibility as Director for Data Development in the Office of the Presidency, how does the Mexican government approach the issue of data, open data, citizen engagement, and specifically accountability? Is that a word that's used often in relation to data in your day-to-day work?
It is not a word that is used often, but it's kind of implicitly within the conversation. Right now in the Office of the President, what we're trying to do is contribute to this part of the Sustainable Development Goals by providing the raw material that might be needed for the generation of them. We all know it's very important for statistical agencies to develop, the indicators, but it's also, from the President's office, is an important role to actually go and get the data that it's hidden in some of the dependencies of the government and open it up and bring it forward. So within my office, what we're doing right now is we just published a presidential decree on open data. And the whole purpose of the decree is to kind of institutionalize open data within the government of Mexico. So starting, I think it was the second week of February, starting then, all public information in Mexico is going to have to be opened and released through, in open formats through Mexico's Open Data Catalog. And it's going to be a very, very difficult path. It's going to be a path that it's going to take a lot of time. But the way that we're trying to focus our efforts and try to build them within the data revolution for the Sustainable Development Goals is kind of prioritize what to open and when to open it. So right now what we're doing is kind of trying to help our colleagues within the office that had the kind of the following with the development goals, so that the data that they need for the indicators to be generated is open in the very short term. So that's kind of our role. And as we have conversations with the organized civic society in Mexico, that's kind of what we're trying to do with them. For them to actually have a very strong role in suggesting what they think and what they want to be released through our office. And most of our prioritizing is based on those conversations. Because at the end of the day, we want the data to be useful for people out there. So we want to hear what they want rather than just take a decision on our own about what we think is important.
Very good. So clearly the interface also between the political process for getting to where you've got to is quite important. I'm going to turn to Catalina in a minute, but I just wanted to check in the audience, are there any other good country examples that are also going quickly down this path of agreeing protocols on what they release or not, or agreeing to catalogs of open data, actually having that political conversation? Anyone in the audience who is aware of that same thing happening in their country? Right. New Zealand. So do we have any Kiwis here? Just briefly, just to break it up.
Yes, thank you. I come from Rwanda. I'm Claude, and my country the last 2 years passed the Access to Information Law, and now people can request for information, and actually says that information should be delivered in 3 working days. And it's actually on that I built an Access to Information website that I'm showcasing at the innovation fairs. So you're welcome to pass by. But also, with the help of the World Bank, there is the open data law now is in the parliament, where they want to kind of avail data in a very easy format to anyone, either citizen in the country or people from outside. That's what I wanted to share. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much. So, Catalina, how do we make sure that in this process of gradually opening up data and making it freer, how do we make sure that everyone is counted? There are not people that are left behind, that we don't have so much aggregation that we can't track progress across different groups?
I'm going to speak in English now just to make sure my message gets across. So first of all, I would like to say that I do think that these conversations are being discussed between just too few people, and that just the fact that almost few people here speak Spanish gives a good sense about how discussions are being only held at development organizations and organizations that have the capacity to discuss these topics, but more grassroots organizations and civil society organizations that are the ones that actually engage with citizens on a day-to-day basis are not part of these conversations. So I think that that's where the gap starts, and it ends with the citizen that is not having access to all this information and to this data revolution. I was thinking earlier today that honestly, we keep doing the same mistakes with the PC revolution, the mobile revolution, and now with the data revolution. We don't think about the adoption of this information and about the adoption of these technologies. So we all do this so citizens can actually be engaged with this. And there's few discussions about how citizens are going to be using this information. We think about citizens as providers of this information, but not as users of this information. So one of the projects in which we work is a project called Beyond Access. We promote the access and use of information through public libraries. Public libraries have been for centuries the place to go to access information, knowledge. That knowledge has simply changed the format in which we use it. So they used to be books, and now it's in computers and the internet. There's more than 20,000 libraries in Latin America, more than 320,000 libraries in the US, 320,000, I hope I got it right. And now access to information is on the sustainable development agenda. So it's in the post-15 agenda because this is still important for many people. We still see on a day-to-day basis people that have never used a computer, that have never used the internet. How are we expecting those people to really take advantage of this data revolution? We think that this is an old issue, but it's not solved yet. The issue about access to technology, access to information, is still a very current and relevant issue that we need to take into consideration. Otherwise, we would only increase the gaps of knowledge, and that becomes a social gap as well. So the way we expect to promote this, again, is through public libraries. So we're working in different projects in Latin America. Well, Beyond Access is a project that works throughout the world, but my role and my responsibility is to make sure that local governments include libraries in the development agendas, that whenever, for example, a country develops a digital agenda, which many countries do, to make sure that libraries are included and that the adoption of technology and of information is included in the agendas as well. So we are engaging civil society, private sector, public sector, and development organizations to make sure that no one is left behind, as you said it, Paul. And we believe that the most democratic way of doing this and the most accessible way of doing this is with public libraries. Every single town, at least in Latin America and in many countries around the world, has a library. We just need to strengthen them. But many of them already have computers and access to the internet. So we're working very closely with them and also with civil society, because social organizations are the ones that are usually delivering the social services and information services to the citizens. But if they're not strong enough in the use of technology, we're not doing anything. So there's a lot of bridges to be crossed. But again, that's the way we're saying that this really reaches out to people and that citizens can be engaged with this information with very simple amounts of information. We don't have to overwhelm them with all these things, but really useful things, as Sarah was discussed earlier today. I really liked her speech, because it's really giving parents very specific and useful information about how their kids are doing. So that's in a nutshell what we're doing. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. So I'm going to turn to the audience in a minute, but one more question perhaps. Danny, you came back. You were in the first session when I wasn't here. One of the divides that we face, Min2, I work in the same bubble as Min2 works in. So we see how diplomats negotiate around these issues in New York, and they choose not to use the word accountability. Monitoring was on their list for a while, and eventually it got reduced to, I think, review and follow-up. And one of the key things that you get when you talk with that diplomatic community and with the statistical community is that they're in their comfort zone with certain types of data. They don't want to be held particularly accountable, but they're certainly in their comfort zone on some types of data. And the sorts of data that citizens themselves can generate is of a different kind. It's qualitative, it's participatory, it may cover a partial community, it may not be comparable, it's more threatening in many ways, and quite frankly, they see it as non-credible. I wanted to ask Danny, how do you bridge that trust gap between these new qualitative, participatory sorts of data to the sorts of things that colleagues in New York go on about all the time?
A tricky question, I suppose. Two answers at two different levels. The simple level is that it's never been easier to build in quality controls for even the sorts of citizen-generated data that we're now able to talk about. So, I think the threshold for introducing a level of quality control that allows your data to be taken seriously is easier than before. A good example is that last week I spent some time with the chief executives of Plan International, World Vision, Save the Children, and so forth. Between them, they interact with millions of children on a daily basis. I challenge these guys, what sort of data are you collecting that might help us with the accountability piece on the SDGs? And because they haven't been used to working with each other, but because they haven't also thought about or put faith in their own ability to collect data, I think they haven't come up with a clever way of mustering up that data. So, the dream is, if you've got these massive organizations to tap into their own administrative data, you'd have a source that's probably much more powerful than any, education census done on an annual basis by a National Statistical Office. But the other aspect of trust that I throw back at these guys is not necessarily trust in the data, but trust in the institutions. And that gets into a really interesting terrain, because, you might have a census official with a clipboard who turns up and collects information, and the information they produced may well be considered more trustworthy. But actually, the interesting thing is when the people who are collecting the data, and we heard from Elvis and many others about, if those people themselves are in a trusted relationship with that person, they're not there to gather information about that person that they're going to take away and use, but instead it's a long-term relationship, then it becomes much more interesting. And that's where the sort of citizen-led accountability mechanisms are actually much more trustworthy than the data generated by our census gatherers and others.
Okay, great. Thank you, Danny. So let me stop here and just pause and ask if there are any questions from the audience for our panel members who work in different spheres.
Paul,
any questions? Right, we have one at the back there. We'll take three, and then Natalia. Sorry, just that. So there's one at the back there, just the gentleman in the... There we go.
Buenas tardes, Humberto Llances, equipo humanitario de OpenStreetMap. La pregunta va dirigida a, luego que generemos los datos, que los ciudadanos tengamos la posibilidad con todos estos medios de dispositivos móviles y la enorme cantidad de herramientas en software libre y datos abiertos geoespaciales que existen, ¿cómo podemos o cuál sería la vía indicada para que ahora los gobiernos acepten esos datos como datos de calidad y que pueden ser utilizados para la planeación urbana o la toma de decisiones de política.
Aló. Mi pregunta es la siguiente. Hace un tiempo nadie o muy pocas organizaciones tenían páginas web con sus datos o una forma de presentarle al público toda la información sobre lo que están haciendo. Hoy en día todas las organizaciones tienen su página web y todo el mundo está mostrando sus resultados a través del mismo medio. La pregunta es cómo hacer para que también se pueda como aprovechar la información para que no se vaya a la misma fuente a preguntarle lo mismo 2 veces, para que 2 organizaciones o 3 organizaciones diferentes publiquen la misma información. ¿Cómo lograr un poquito mejor articulación entre las nuevas plataformas de información?
Okay, so 2 very different questions there, if I understood them. I've just checked with Eduardo that I can ask him this, but basically the question is, I mean, Eduardo works in a national government, so within that political context, you know, what would it take for an information source generated by citizens to be credible for policy making in the Mexican government?
I'd like to think, I mostly do data analysis for public policy within the office. And I'd like to think that there's no bad data, but just badly specified data. So while it's going to be hard at the end of the day to actually make citizen-generated data something that we can publish as government, there's always tremendous opportunities to actually use it to generate public policy that works better than the one that's been implemented. So it was great to hear someone from OpenStreetMap, especially the humanitarian efforts, because we're currently working with the Mexico section of that team about disaster response. And one of the things that we're doing is how can we mix both government data that we generate that in most circumstances we wouldn't even publish, and mix it up with the data that people from outside government do, so that we can better inform policymakers in Mexico in disaster response decisions. So we're currently piloting for this summer, how can we actually provide a toolkit for the guys in Mexico that do disaster response, particularly extreme hydrometeorological events, so that they can take better decisions when an emergency occurs. So they all have the kit of the available information that they have using government-owned satellites and administrative data from different sources of government, but there's always so much that can be generated directly from users. So I think that's kind of what we should be going in the future, and it's a big trade-off, but it's a big trade-off sometimes. I think policymakers think that using data that they don't generate, that they don't have a kind of quality control over, sometimes they cannot be the most confident about it. But what we try to do, and what we're trying to do in the future, is to make use cases to show that, yes, it might not be exactly what you wanted and statistically the most clean of data, but it's going to be useful. So it's always a political decision at the end of the day, because you have to convince people that have been doing stuff the way they do it for 40-odd years, and for them to get someone new and tell them that they can do stuff differently, it's a hard conversation sometimes. So we need to show some use cases that work, and after that get traction based on this worked one time, it might work for other scenarios.
Okay, Mintu?
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to some of these points that Danny just raised about institutional credibility and trustworthiness when we're looking at data, and some of the points that Carolina mentioned about giving citizens access to information and data. And I think about the country that I was born in, Vietnam, and and what transparency of data and even social service provision by the government looks like, and what information citizens actually have about their own situations to be able to hold their government accountable. And that, you can see, is very difficult. And I was asked to be provocative or try to be controversial on this. And so I think my question to you all is, and it's difficult for me where I sit dealing with global level decision making, but why is getting accountability right at the global level, why does that matter? Isn't it enough to have Mexico and Colombia, you heard earlier today, our speaker from the government about the great ways that Colombia is making information more transparent for its people. If it's already happening at the national level, if citizens can hold their governments accountable at the national level, especially for those governments that are open to it and are actively doing some great things, why does it matter to have accountability work at the global level? I'd love to hear that case made. And the only answer I can really come up with is what happens to the Vietnams of the world. And, you know, in other countries that where it is a little bit more difficult, where you do have more of the backlash or the pushback.
It's a great question. And in New York, the discussion is primarily about global review, global thematic review, global meetings. It's completely flipped on its head. 90% of the time is spent thinking about something called the High-Level Political Forum, the HLPF, instead of that cornerstone of national reviews. Let me pick up on the question from Natalia, and maybe I can turn it to you, Mashiri. We're in this space, we're talking about lots of really interesting practical ideas to bring people into the debate, into the implementation of this agenda. What about all the inefficiencies that exist? I mean, you talked about accountability in different directions. Are we all doing the same thing with the same groups of people, asking questions, spending a lot of money on surveys, starting up new initiatives? Is there any sort of sensible rationalization that you think we could, you know, learn from, in particular from your experience?
I think borrowing from the controversial note that's been said, this is an incestuous space to a very large extent. If you attend the Open Government meeting in London and then go off to a Data Revolution meeting in Cambodia and then come to Nairobi for some, you know, open something meeting, there's a very good chance you know everybody in the room, or quite a few people. And I think we're probably now in an opportunity where the space has been opened up a little bit. The one thing, and I will say I do have data revolution fatigue in terms of the word. In its,
you're tired of the revolution.
Just the use of the word, you know, it's just everywhere. But it did one huge thing for the community globally. It created a new big tent. Now we have the open data folks sitting with the National Statistics Office folks in the same spaces. Now we have the Hewlett Foundation sitting with the Infonets and sitting with, you know, HelpAge. HelpAge International. I'd never seen HelpAge International at an Open Anything meeting. You know, didn't seem like their space. So I think the fact that we now have Save the Children walking in, we have Oxfam walking in, we have some of these large international organizations sitting in that space where I didn't see them before, for me signals a new tent, a new space, and new actors. You know, so at least at the global level, we have new voices, cross-pollinating. But the challenge still remains that we may be speaking still again, creating a new big tent and staying within it, and not spreading out. I think the opportunities to expand the conversation, get new voices into the space, are there. I still don't see enough of government at this meeting, for instance. Legislators are very thin in their presence. I'd like to see more legislators at these meetings, because they are at some point going to play a huge oversight role, and a very important role in domesticating these frameworks. If they're not here now, they may not understand why some things are there, why we're claiming that some ideas are transformative, or why some things are supposed to be universal. And that could be a problem. One thing though, in Africa, around the word accountability and the nervousness of member states to use it outdoors, I think at the UN, the experience may be slightly different from the African Union, because I think I see the word accountability used with abandon within the African context. It's there in the normative frameworks. It's there in national development plans. It's there in public statements by heads of state and government. It's a big part of the African peer review mechanism, which despite its flagging nature in the last few years is coming back to life, I prophesy. But this tells you that there's something different happening in Africa, and the context within the continent needs to be taken into account when things move from Addis, speaking of AU, to New York. So I think in our engagements, keeping in mind that it's the behavior changes when people cross the ocean. It needs to be factored into our negotiations. It needs to be factored into advocacy. And if we're not making much progress with the words accountability in New York, and yet we may be making good progress with them and with that idea and pushing that agenda on the continent in Africa, then it might mean that for us, we need to spend more time in Africa and get that agenda moving rather than there. But then what does that mean in Southeast Asia? I think it means that Southeast Asian countries, specifically in this case, or Latin American countries need to organize around an indigenous idea of accountability and work from there. How that ends up being a universal framework might be a whole lot more complex, but it might have better grassroots impact because people at the local level would be on the same page on what they expect accountability to look like. So that's my 2 cents. 1 cent for you, 1 cent,
Well, I'll collect that later. Catalina, would you like to come in on any of the questions that have been asked? No, but I don't have There we go. And if the audience can think of more questions that you want to pose or just points you want to make quickly about this topic, the floor is open. So.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that I think that following up on your provocative question, I think that the conversations need to happen at both levels. I actually used to work for the World Bank, but now I'm sort of sitting on the other side of the fence, and I do think that conversations at that level are important because that's how governments might get peer-to-peer pressure, which can be good. And I also think that that's what helps us monitor what's happening on a worldwide basis and compare how different countries are doing. But I do agree with you with what you're saying, and is that many discussions at the grassroots level, at the local level, are having great progress and great advancements, and sometimes we need to look at those and have sort of early wins and showcase all those cases to show that this is important and that this revolution of data is important, and that helps us also escalate the issue. So, so talking about your point, I think that the level of discussion is important at both levels and even regionally. So for example, our reach is Latin America, and we have a lot of discussions with governments. So for example, we go to the government in Peru and we tell them, hey, this is what is happening in Uruguay, and they sort of feel challenged about what's happening in other places. And that's good because it helps them drive good practices and also talk among them. So it's not every country learning by themselves, but these regional and worldwide discussions make sure that practices, good or bad, can be shared across the board.
So there's value in global comparability and the peer pressure that can bring. And there's also value in local, heterogeneous, context-specific, community-owned citizens' engagement. So how do you get both? That's a question I'll come back to, but we have two from the floor. I'll take Philip first, and then our guest over here.
So I think I see the frustration between Angelina and Paul, and it's quite interesting, and I was sharing with Dozie that at some point we dropped out of the international space and started listening to governments in Africa. You'll find it interesting that governments were complaining that they were never involved in my world. So they were not involved in that process. So that problem number one, especially when we talk about developing countries. Number two is that there's also a disconnect between the ambassadors in New York and national level and country level governments. And that's why Mushiri is talking about how it's easy for us to walk into government and talk about accountability and transparency. But then, how do we resolve this? I think this is the question number one. How do you resolve this? Now, how do you use a couple of us who are actually at national level who can perhaps help mediate that kind of conversation? Because in Kenya, for example, I co-chair an SDGs and private sector financing. I co-chair this at the Office of the Deputy President. It's quite, so there are a lot of this, and I'm not the only one. So how do you do that? I think the second bit, again, is also in terms of language and context. It's easy, for example, for Africa to talk about Common Africa Position on post-2015, and not necessarily SDGs per se. So I mean, how do we simply align language? The African government's actually comfortable. That's why for us, sometimes we think it's semantics, but also it's also how do you bring them on board so that they feel that they are part of generating the development goals.
Brilliant, thank you. When we put the My World survey together, we included the options, an honest and responsive government, political freedoms, freedom from discrimination and persecution. I feel if we'd have had to have agreed it with governments, we'd never have got there. So it was a trick we pulled. Please.
Gracias. Sí, quisiera mencionar un caso donde se ha recogido tanto a nivel global como local datos de excelente calidad, no solamente recogidos por los gobiernos, la academia, sino también por la sociedad civil, y me refiero a la política del control del tabaco que logró que la Organización Mundial de la Salud aprobara un convenio global que estoy segura ha suscrito la mayoría de los países que podemos estar aquí representados. Y teniendo tan buena información de esas dos fuentes, sociedad civil y academia, me pregunto a la hora de concretar y desarrollar esas políticas a nivel local con tan buena información, con datos de tan buena calidad como creo que era una petición que hacía Dani. Sin embargo, nos enfrentamos a la presión de las multinacionales tabacaleras que influyen en los gobiernos de manera velada y no se puede terminar de concretar muchas de estas políticas. Entonces, me preocupa un poco que a veces hablamos de los datos, de la calidad de datos, de la revolución de los datos, y me preocupa si estamos poniendo esto en contexto en términos de lo que sería la participación de la sociedad civil, tanto local como global, porque no solamente se trata de interlocutar con los gobiernos, sino con transnacionales que deciden a veces a través de tratados de libre comercio o de otro tipo de acuerdos, terminan decidiendo políticas incluso de esta naturaleza, de la naturaleza global de una política como la que acabo de mencionar de control del tabaco. Entonces quisiera escuchar algo de los panelistas.
So thank you. So in the minute, I'm going to turn to the panelists to address the questions and also any other concluding remarks that you want to leave with the audience. But one more from Matthew first.
Thanks, Paul. Just on the controversial question, I mean, I think there are other reasons why we need a global and national framework. One is, and I take this from Vietnam, where I went a couple of years ago for the Interparliamentary Union, and there was a consensus among everybody. We were looking at health policy and parliamentarians' involvement in that, that if there hadn't been an MDG framework out there, it was very unlikely that the Vietnamese government would ever have cared about whether their health policy was reaching the poorest people in the country, that they would have just gone ahead with some kind of semi-commercial health insurance. And I think that that's true across the world, and even more true in a post-2015 framework, when allegedly this is going to become universal. So maybe people in Spain will start, governments in Spain will start caring about the impact that their policies have been having on their poorest people, which you and human rights people have been decrying for the last few months. But I also think there's really important that we be really honest about this. And one of the things I'm always concerned about, for example, in all the AMRs and reviews of the MDGs that happen in New York, is that people stand up and do public relations and say, here's why everything's been successful. And I'd like to hear more discussion over the next couple of days about why things don't happen and what goes wrong and why things don't work, rather than just all of us, as I just did a few minutes ago, promoting things that are going reasonably well.
At least you're being honest. Well, the AMRs were good stories. They were set up in a space to encourage people, but of course they were government's own narrative on MDG progress. I'm going to, just take one more. Natalia, just because we're stressed for time. One more, then back to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's on the same point. So I'm not convinced that there is a particular need for another political process that push the development revolution agenda. I think it is very important that it's there. I think it is it's true that there is more space for discussion, and this space wasn't available before. On the other hand, what would be quite useful, I guess, would be a development, a global body, global partnership, whatever you want to call this, that is able to foster discussions around, for example, technical issues that countries have. How do they go for to implement the development data revolution in their own countries? How do they get to have the national consensus they need? How do they get subnational data, but then to leave the political discussions at the national level? Another thing, whatever shape this is going to take, if it's going to go forward, it would be very, very useful to consult organizations that already work in this space to understand what they actually need. What do they want to take out of this partnership? What would be very useful for them? How can we add value to this? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now back to the panel. Any preference? Do I start the left-hand side or the right-hand side? Who's ready?
The question I can answer the most about is when they were talking about, for example, interest groups that react negatively to data that is released, in the case of the smoking data that they were talking about. And in Mexico, I mean, we have a case story that we're living right now about how can we fight that, or at least get civil society to help us fight that. So one of the cool things about data is that when it's out, it's very hard to refute. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the case of mining concessions in Mexico right now. So as they were talking about smoking data and probably the big tobacco companies getting angry about the data, about the impact that they have, about the negative impact that they have, and they react negatively. So what happened in Mexico is that this year we had the OPE government partnership. And when we first got on board, well, the Mexican president signed a set of commitments with organized civil society in Mexico. And one of them was, let's open up mining concession contracts in Mexico. And it was really helpful for us as members of government to have those commitments signed by the president. Because when we go out to the different owners of that data within the government of Mexico, it's a very, very hard discussion because they don't want to open it up for so many reasons. And the main reason is if they open it up, there's no way back. People are going to have the full picture about what's been going on. They're going to have negative publicity. Interest groups such as mining companies in Mexico are going to get very angry because civil society is going to have tools to actually show them what they've been doing wrong. And that's the cool part about kind of peer-to-peer pressure at the very top level. So Mexico joined the OGP because of peer pressure within the governments. When they signed that, they kind of adhere to fulfilling commitments with civil society organizations. And that, as members of the Office of the President, when the President signed us, kind of gave us the power to go out and look for it, regardless of if other people in government or people with private interests wanted it out or not. And it's a really cool example because right now we're in the midst of it. And it's been, I mean, the President signed this almost a year and a half ago. And we have continuing discussions that get very technical because the people that own the data don't want to pull it out. And we have the power now because the President signed that. And it's one of those things that I hope kind of creates a change in Mexico when we finally get the mining concessions out and people out there can actually see what the impact of what's been going on the last 20 years in Mexico has been. And you have to get all the whole ecosystem, kind of peer pressure on the top and also civic engagement at the bottom, so that at the end of the day you have meaningful data out that can hopefully impact public policy.
Excellent, thank you. Jury.
So just to jump off that right there, what the regional process is, whether it's for us, whether it's the East African Community or the African Union, what the normative frameworks and the process and the outcomes of those processes produce, whatever it is, gives us an opportunity to walk into a head of state's office and say our country is a signatory to this, or you are part of the group that adopted this, and therefore we need to move this agenda forward. So there's a huge opportunity there, and it's that kind of that same thing, but at the national level, at the top level. And at the sub-national level, or within the ministries, departments, and agencies in government, the moment you have high-level endorsement of a process that that individual already bound his country to, it becomes easier to have that conversation at the lower levels of government as well. So this is just to say that whatever happens at the international level gives us ammunition, gives us a tool that we can leverage within our own national and sub-national governments. But I just want to leave two things on the table. You know the way we say, I'll leave this right here. One thing I'd like to leave right here is let's think about supporting and strengthening first before creating something new. There are, I've had this at this meeting, and I've had it in many meetings before. The revolution has already been happening. But to what extent are we seeking to strengthen whatever then we are saying has been happening and supporting it before going off to start entirely new partnerships, entirely new institutions? Let's strengthen first and support first, and then build on whatever is there, and then probably create something new. And the second thing is, as civil society, especially my colleagues in civil society in the room and private sector, are we adjusting for the sovereignty of states? There are some things that are the business of government. My organization is not in the business of providing healthcare to the people of Kenya. They are taxpayers. They have a government that they have a delegated power to at the ballot box that's supposed to deliver. And the whole accountability relationship, quite frankly, is between them and the state. And I think some of the work that we set out to do, either because we are aligning to whether it's donor priorities or to political priorities, I think sometimes do more damage than good, because we set out to subvert the state's role, to usurp the state's role. And in essence, in my opinion, some of that work tends to be disrespectful to the people. And I think there's a thin line that I cannot quite articulate right now. In Mushirian, in my head, it sounds very clear. But I think you get the picture, that we need to be careful about where our work starts and ends, and where the role of the state starts and ends, so that we have not just mutual accountability, but we also have mutual respect. So that's what I'm going to leave right here.
Thank you very much. Mintu.
Wow, that's great. There's so much brilliance on this panel and in this room. I'm humbled. So I wanted to pick up on this idea of indigenous accountability, and especially in this comment about connecting New York and capital, because it is absolutely 100% true that there is a huge gap between what negotiators in New York are saying and doing and agreeing to, and what even their government counterparts are saying from their capital. And if you all in civil society are advocating only to your national government folks, and that message isn't then being carried over to New York, you're going to get something at the end of the day that doesn't reflect the advocacy that you're pushing for in your capitals. So please, whatever you do, come to me. We can try to get you to New York, get your ideas, brought into that process. It's part of what I tried to do, so please do that, because it really is important to connect the New York, the Addis conversation and those in New York. Multinational corporations, this point, I think it was addressed in our first panel quite a bit, but clearly, there's a role for civil society to play in making sure that the governance and the accountability works out there. There was a point about NGOs being able to put data there, and Eduardo, you mentioned that once data is out, it's very hard to refute. And I think for those governments that are less likely to make data transparent, if civil society organizations, and in particular teaming up with your international counterparts, put that data out there, it's very hard for governments to refute. And I think that's really the power of civil society-based data collection and dissemination. The goals and the targets, the point up here, I'm sorry, I can't remember your name. Martin, is that right? Yes. You know, I think it's absolutely critical. The SDGs, the idea of global goal setting, remember what was so impactful about the MDGs? It was because then you could say, governments have agreed to this, we can track whether or not they've gotten to that, and if they haven't, we can see what's falling behind. You can go to donors, you can go to the World Bank, the UN, and say, look, for instance, on maternal mortality, we're not doing so well. Halfway through the MDGs, we looked at it and we said, hey, actually, there's a lot of countries that aren't doing so well. So now what do we have to do to step up? And the idea of global goal setting really is in and of itself one way to get at accountability and monitoring progress. And so I think we really have to try to make sure we have the best goals and targets out there. And I think right now we have a really good set, and looking at indicators and how we help to measure the goals and the targets is really critical, and I think civil society has a really big role to play there, especially when you're looking at a universal agenda. We're not just talking about data for countries that are the poorest. You look at the United States, where I live, and in others, it's really important to make sure that we're able to measure that. And so I think, notwithstanding the comments here about the role of the state and really being able to support the role of the state in all of this, I think there really is an important role for civil society to make sure that you're putting in place the mechanisms and the tools to hold governments accountable, both globally and locally. Thanks.
Thank you, Mintu. Catalina, last word.
Yeah, so I'm going to jump right in where you left off, because I was going to say exactly that there's sort of two groups that are key development actors that are being left out of this conversation, and one is civil society. I would have loved to see more civil society representation here in this event. I think this is a totally foreign discussion to civil society. They are worried about solving human rights issues, education, and health problems, and they don't know how this data revolution and how information is relevant to what they're doing. So I think that there's a lot of advocacy and outreach and adoption that needs to be done in front of civil society, also to hold governments accountable, but also multinationals and these greater discussions that are happening. And also, finally, citizens. We all do this for people to improve their lives. And again, I think that they're being left out of this conversation, and being left out of how are we going to be able to reach them with all this information, tools, and knowledge that they need. So development is finally about people, so I think that we need to do greatest efforts to reach out to them. And again, we believe that libraries are a great place to do it. And I'm actually physically going to leave on the table 5 cases that are actually explaining how people are interacting with governments through libraries for training, for capacity building, for economic development, and different topics. Unfortunately, it's in Spanish, but if anybody's interested, I can send out an English version because we do have it. So thank you so much, and thanks, Paul.
Yeah, thank you very much. So now that just leaves me to do 3 things. The first is if you could all put your hands together for the people on the panel and also the questions that you've asked. Secondly, many of you will have left very important pieces of ID just with the people outside the door, and they want your headsets back and you want your ID back. So please take your headsets back now with the 5 minutes that we've got before the reception. And then the third thing is please join us out in the courtyard for a combination of things. One is a drink to celebrate the first day, but we've also got some very interesting data into art, data cartoon collaborations with the Open Data Institute and others. So it's a bit of fun at the end of a hard day with a drink. So please come and join us outside.